Could be a cool show tonight. There's a theme I've noticed already on the website, Coast to Coast AM, for tonight's show. You ready? It's startling and shocking. I love that. In fact, that's what we do have. We have shocking proof that John Lennon foretold his own death and perhaps sold his soul to the devil. So says one writer. And startling new evidence that the death of General George S. Patton was not as it has been presented, that in fact he was assassinated. I love this book. It's called Target Patton, The Plot to Assassinate General George S. Patton. In the end, I don't know that Robert Wilcox has the slam dunk smoking gun case that would really, make everybody a believer, but he has got some amazing research that leads you right up to that conclusion, that Patton was assassinated. Now, you may have heard of this theory before. I have to confess, it was an experience to me not unlike when they say you buy a green car, and then after you buy a green car, you're driving around and you notice how many other green cars are on the road that you didn't know until you had one. And it was like that for me on this book. I got this book. I started reading it on, I don't know, whenever I started reading it the second I broke it out of the box. Loved it. And then I started telling people, I was walking around with it while I was reading it, and they say, "What are you reading?" I'm saying, "Oh, I'm reading this book about how George S. Patton was assassinated." And how many people walked in and go, "Oh, yeah, I know that theory." And then they would start telling me stuff that was in the book. And I'm like, oh, man, I didn't realize how commonly this was being discussed in some circles. And for that matter, how some people had already come to the conclusion that it makes perfect sense. And it does. And we'll let Robert Wilcox make his case coming up next hour. He'll be our main guest on Coast to Coast. But first, just to get us started, as the freezing rain and light snow in the upper Midwest comes my way, where I'm expected sometime during the course of this show tonight to get as many as maybe as 3 or 4 inches of snow between now and tomorrow morning. I give you, coming up next, Joe Diaz-Godas on Lennon, which will mean when we couple that with crypto news, we've got dream teams, dream machines, and dream writers next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. All right, so heading into our first hour guest in just a second, let me remind you what's coming up tomorrow night on Coast to Coast AM. I'm going to be on the program tomorrow night, second Sunday of the month, and our guest will be none other than Dean Koontz, one of the greatest fiction writers at work in America today. And his new book is Your Heart Belongs to Me. And it's a spooky story about a guy who gets a heart transplant, and then the shocking and startling events that happen after that. He is stalked by somebody who believes that they have every right to the feelings and emotions that the person has. And, well, I'll leave that for now because I haven't read more than like the first 15, 20 pages of the book, because I was reading this new book on Patton until about 37 minutes ago. I finally finished it. So tomorrow night, Dean Koontz, and I'll have a chance to read his book tomorrow, and we love having him on, and it'll be very cool. And because it's Dean Koontz, of course, this means that inevitably we're going to be spending a little time talking about dogs. Dogs, angels, in the holiday season. And did you see that story about dogs in the news this week? We'll share that tomorrow night with the guy who watches them very closely, Dean Koontz. In crypto news for tonight, if there were acorns out on my front lawn, you wouldn't be able to find them. I already have, 3 or 4 inches of snow out there. There have been several early snowstorms so far this season in the upper Midwest. Last year, we didn't get our first real snow until right around Christmas. But this year it's coming in fast, and they're coming in thick. These snowstorms are affecting us, but up and down the East Coast, residents and naturalists alike have been scratching their heads over a simple question: where are all the acorns? This is a story that CNN presented. I thought it was fascinating. Oak trees have shed their leaves, but the usual carpet of acorns is not crunching underfoot. In far-flung pockets of Northern Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and other states, scientists have found no acorns whatsoever. 0. I can't think of any other year like this, said one naturalist. The mystery has found its way onto the internet where, quote, no acorns this year discussion on topics.com yielded more than 180 comments from people reporting acorn disappearances as far away as Connecticut and North Carolina. What is going on? Screamed a resident in Maplewood, New Jersey. Now we're finding dead squirrels, too. Should we all be concerned? Not necessarily, naturalists say. Last year, a bumper crop of acorns might be the answer to this. Scientists say that when acorn production runs in cycles, you can have a big down year after a big crop year, and last year was a big crop year. It fits with the physiology of seed reproduction. They report in this CNN story, the trees are exhausted energy-wise from last year. But even if some people are surprised at the complete absence of nuts in parts of Virginia, I'm not. Think about it. There are no nuts in parts of Virginia because I think they all rolled up to Washington, right? Maybe they're just nuts about secrecy there. The Federal Reserve refused a request by Bloomberg News to disclose the recipients of more than $2 trillion of emergency loans from U.S. taxpayers, and the assets of the central bank is accepting as collateral. Quote, if they told us what they held, we would know the potential losses that the government may take, and that they don't want us to know that, said a senior managing director at a New York-based firm. Yeah, because, if the government told the people all the things they were doing, that might lead to, democracy. Brett McKeon writes, the truth isn't just out there, it's apparently right near the Sydney Harbor Bridge. Shocked Daily Telegraph reader Steve Joliffe spotted what appears to be a flying saucer hovering directly above Miller's Point while checking out Google Maps. Anybody can go see it. You can link up to this story through coasttocoastam.com. You can see on a Google Maps image, is that a UFO? I live in the street on the corner. It was a beautiful view of the harbor. I was just trying to get a look on the Google when I saw it. It just caught my eye. I couldn't get back to bed. I thought it was a UFO straight away. The bizarre discovery comes at the tail end of a bumper year for close encounters of the third kind all over Australia. Perhaps it's not a coincidence that the new version of The Day the Earth Stood Still comes at the end of a busy year of UFO sightings. In the Online Examiner, The Day the Earth Stood Still, fiction or fact? The remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still, which opens Friday, December 12th, and the original version from 1951 could be more factual than you think. So says the Examiner, though the current movie trailer indicates a departure from the early script. Boulder resident Paulo Harris teaches a course about Hollywood's role in disclosing UFO information. She has proposed that the 1951 version of The Day the Earth Stood Still may have been the first collaboration between the military and the film industry. The goal was to get the public used to the reality that, quote, we are not alone. The Day the Earth Stood Still could hardly have been the first collaboration, though, between the military and the film industry, if you ask me. But maybe it was the goal of the picture to get the public used to the idea of friendly or misunderstood aliens. Not having seen this new movie, however, I think the better question is, Keanu Reeves acting, fact or fiction? We'll know in a couple weeks. From Phys.org.com, for years, many physicists have accepted that dark matter is composed of weakly interacting massive particles, or WIMPs. Weakly interacting massive particles. The fact that WIMPs can naturally explain the amount of dark matter in the universe left over from the Big Bang has been described as the WIMP miracle. Not everyone, though, thinks this phenomenon represents an ironclad prediction that dark matter is made of WIMPs. We know little about dark matter since we can't measure it directly, says Jonathan Feng of Phys.org.com, but there are theories and models. WIMPs are attractive because they happen to appear in many popular theories of new particles and interactions. WIMPs that are attractive? Sort of like the music of Rick Astley? Cheap shot. In fact, Rick Astley parodied himself in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Did you see that on YouTube? Man, that was funny. I had a new level of respect for him. He was on some sort of parade float about the North Pole, and he stepped out and started singing in a way that was a tribute to all of the Rick Astley pranks that get played on YouTube, all the YouTube pranks that feature the music of Rick Astley. It was pretty funny. And speaking of switcheroos on the North Pole, that was a stretch. It was a dying on a scale never before seen on Earth. The slaughter was everywhere, writes Michael Riley in Discovery, the online version of the cable channel. The slaughter was everywhere. The fertile ocean, the balmy supercontinent Pangaea were transformed into killing fields, littered with the bodies of ancient animals. By the time the dust had settled 250 million years ago, 90% of life on the planet had been snuffed out. The new theory suggests it all started with the magnetic pole shift. The superplume hot material of, gas rising up and everything all starts with a shift in the poles. And by the way, that led to the birth of supervolcanoes, and that's a handy reminder, according to many scientists, that we are already overdue for a magnetic pole shift. It could happen any day, but when it comes, it's not just going to screw up the new iPhone you're getting for Christmas. It's going to create something much bigger. Not that it's going to happen at Christmas, but you know what I'm saying. At least it's the iPhone I was hoping to get for Christmas. I say I was because the latest piece of techno gadgetry is so massively cool. It makes the iPhone look like a pencil. While other presents may have you going to bed on Christmas Eve with dreams of sugar plums dancing in your head, this new device can actually show you the sugar plums. A research team in Japan has successfully displayed simple images produced in the human brain on a computer screen. Cool. In a nutshell, that is to say, a nutshell for everybody except in parts of Virginia where there are no acorns left, the device converts electrical signals sent to the visual cortex into images that can be viewed on a computer screen. In their experiment, they showed test subjects the 6 letters in the word neuron and succeeded in reconstructing the word on screen by measuring the brain activity. As the technology progresses, it could be possible to see what people are thinking, what they dream about, and record it for posterity. I wish I had one of those things right now. Just this week, I had the weirdest dream that I cannot remember. But have you ever woken up from a deep sleep with the last thought you had when you were dreaming, but you can't remember why you had that last thought? It's like you leapt back from sleep world to waking world with the last thought, but no context for it. The other night, and I'm not making this up, I woke up with this thought. Yeah, but wouldn't it be easier if we just found prostitutes that could sing happy birthday? And I have no idea what the dream was about. I just remember waking up kind of agitated because the person I was talking to in my dream just didn't seem to get it. The simple beauty of my logic. Yeah, but wouldn't it be easier if we just found prostitutes that could sing happy birthday? I had no idea what it's about. So, if you were the other person in my dream, and you know what I was talking about, if you remember what the argument was, let me know. Better yet, maybe I don't want to know what we were talking about. Joe Niezgoda has written a book about a guy that did a lot of dream writing. He would have a dream, and then he would turn around and he would write a song from that. Often got melodies and lyrics completely come to him in a dream. John Lennon kept a pad of paper and a pen next to the bed and wrote down these thoughts all the time, and they often turned into major hits. We know this because we have not just been John Lennon fans for years, but also because it wasn't that long ago that we were in a discussion on Coast to Coast AM with May Pang. In fact, I just talked to May earlier this week on the anniversary of the death of John Lennon. And so I have her tender heart in my mind here as we have this conversation, Joe, about whether or not John Lennon had made a deal with the devil. First of all, good evening, and how are you?
I'm fine, Ian, and I'm very glad to be with you tonight. Okay,
so you're a Lennon fan, a Beatles fan?
Oh, I'm an avid first-generation Beatle fan. Ever since they appeared on Ed Sullivan in 1964, I was hooked.
Yeah, like so many of us. So what led you to start investigating whether or not John Lennon had made a deal with the devil?
Well, as an avid Beatle fan, you might be aware of the Paul death clues. The Beatles have always had something sinister surrounding them, in as much as the Paul McCartney death clues fascinated me and many other fans. But the clues just didn't fit. I couldn't connect the dots. But once John Lennon was murdered, I pointed the clues from Paul McCartney, the initial clues that I had amassed through the years and that many people have done the same with, towards John Lennon. And then all of a sudden, these round pegs were fitting in round holes.
Okay. Very interesting thought on this. The new book is called The Lennon Prophecy, The New Examination of the Death Clues of the Beatles. So if it's the death clues of the Beatles, then it sounds like you're saying, and I've read a little bit about this, but I'm just filling for everybody else, that the Beatles were kind of in on this too then, that at least in some form or fashion, this was something that you're not the first person to figure this out.
No, it's been around since, like I say, since the beginning of the Beatles. And in fact, they themselves played the game. I mean, John Lennon, I'll give you an example. John Lennon in the song Glass Onion, he says, quote, and here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul. But
Right.
what was interesting was that was from 1968, and the Paul McCartney death clues, that didn't even become public or, in the public domain until 1969. So it's a little bit interesting. There's a little of a timeline break there. He was giving clues to people who hadn't yet discovered the fact that these clues were there.
Okay, well, some people would say that that's because it never existed. In the case of Paul McCartney, that he wasn't killed. There was no body switch, as was alleged, that Paul had been killed in a car accident and the Beatles were leaving clues on their album covers and in their music, that it was just a matter of, it was just, John being clever in a lyric and people seeing that, tying that to things that really had no business being tied together and coming to this conclusion. So where else then do you see clues that says that John Lennon had made a deal with the devil?
Well, part of it is there were a lot of clues about John Lennon's death throughout their songs. I mean, people look at it, they could say it's coincidence, synchronicity, and that very well may be, but if you put everything together and amass it in a book like I did, well, then all of a sudden it paints a little bit of a different picture. It's a little bit more difficult to dismiss. Now, one of the things, this did not start out as a book on selling his soul. This was a book on prophecy, because his death was completely predicted down to the day, the weapon, who, what, when, where. All those questions were answered. And I mean, it's a little bit easier coming back. You know the answer, and you do a little reverse engineering.
Right.
But the fact is, those clues were there. Now, as far as the sinister part with this, with Satan, the Beatles themselves, are responsible for that aspect of it. I mean, one of the telling signs is the Yesterday and Today album. The Yesterday and Today album, the original cover, that was released in 1966, and actually 750,000 copies were printed. And on that album cover, the Beatles are posed with butcher smocks on, and they're covered with pieces of raw meat, and there's infant baby dolls cut up with their heads and arms and torsos laid all around the Beatles. And, that was dismissed, and that was released. And, I mean, there was such an outcry from the
Sure.
public that those albums were recalled. Now, people say that's avant-garde art. You could say whatever you want, but one of the highest forms of Satan worship is infanticide, which is exactly what that could be interpreted as. Infanticide is where you sacrifice young virgin babies to the name of Satan.
Right. And so you dismiss the Beatles' explanation that they were already this was kind of a tweak of the nose of everybody that was, making them out to be such idols and the screaming throngs of fans. That this was just sort of a way of going, hey, look, this is who we really are. We're just we're a bunch of merry pranksters, that kind of a thing.
Well, that could be. I mean, that's one interpretation of it. This just happens to be my interpretation.
Okay.
And I mean, again, there's other signs as well in the book. This isn't the only thing that led me down this path.
Oh, I get that. Well, then we'll go to this coming up then next. Hang on. We're going to put the phone numbers out there, too, so you can join in the conversation. Our first hour guest, Joe Niezgoda, who says that not only did John Lennon prophesy his own demise, but that also that there are clues through all of the Beatles' music that John had made a deal with the devil. Let's go over both of those in greater detail coming up next. The book is The Lennon Prophecy next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. All right, during the break here, I'll get my blog up on crypto news from earlier this hour. Coming up tomorrow night, don't forget, it's Dean Koontz back on again. Always fun when Dean Koontz comes on and tells such interesting stories. And in this case, the new book is just creepy in its premise. It's called Your Heart Belongs to Me. A guy who's had a heart transplant finds himself being stalked by a woman who says that she is entitled to everything he owns. It's not what you think. We'll talk about it coming up tomorrow night on Coast to Coast. Coming up next hour, looking forward to our conversation with Robert Wilcox. The book is called Target Patton, and it explores the question of whether or not George S. Patton was assassinated. If there ever was a compendium on the evidence for a conspiracy to kill Patton, it's this book. It's a great read, especially perfect for somebody that, lived through that era, maybe somebody who's always had this belief, great for Christmas gift giving, and we'll make the case for you coming up next hour with Robert Wilcox. In the meantime, we'll get back to a couple of your calls, at least, for Joe Niezgoda about the Lennon prophecy. Did John Lennon foresee his own death in such a specific way, as Joe was talking about, including like time and date and place? And then also, could it be that he had sold his soul to the devil for success? We'll hear how Joe lays out that coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. For some reason, I can't. Oh, here I am. I'm just getting the blog thing taken care of, and I click on that. Okay. We'll get to your questions and comments for Joe Niezgoda, the Lennon prophecy, in just a moment. But, Joe, all right, so take us back from the beginning. When do you believe this deal with the devil happened with John Lennon?
Well, I think it was probably back in 1960. These pacts are typically 20 years, and, tracing back from the time he died in 1980, it would go back to 1960.
Tell me, when you say typically they're 20 years, how do you get that?
Well, it's everything that I've put in this book is nothing, I made up nothing. Everything is based on historical information and things that have been written in literature, since the beginning of writings. They've talked about Satanism and deals with the devil.
Well, okay, but I'm saying I'm a little familiar with the writings about that. I've never heard a 20-year pact. So what does that mean exactly?
Well, it just means that, like with Dr. Faust as an example, it was a 20-year pact where you would bargain with the devil for your soul in return for 20 years of prosperity or whatever it is you bargained for. But it's usually a 20-year cycle.
Okay, so it's not just the end of your natural life.
No, it would not be the end of your natural life. It would be, like I say, from the time of the start of the pact.
All right, and any idea where this transaction would have occurred?
It's difficult to say, but he had some real ties when he was off in Germany, and a lot of his anti-Christian behavior could be traced back to the times when, even before Ringo joined the group, when Pete Best was their drummer. In Pete Best's book, he talks about some of John's anti-Christian behavior, so it goes back to the days of Germany.
Okay, and in the deal with the devil, the deal was for success, personal success, typically. Do you see any other riders in the contract? Is there anything else? It's just a matter of finance and world fame, or give me an idea of what you think this pact, was about specifically. Well,
I think the pact, a pact or a contract is something that could be viewed as a legitimate transaction. The way if in the book, The Lennon Prophecy, I point out that this may have been something a little more devious in as much as it may have been a bet. And just because of some of the way these clues have pointed in that direction, in as much as John Lennon may have said something to the effect, "I'd like to be greater than Elvis Presley," because that was one of his main goals in life as a young boy, to the days when he lived with his Aunt Mimi, was to be greater than Elvis. And in fact, he was self-proclaimed, to be greater than Jesus, more popular than Jesus. And so maybe it was part of the bet that the devil made. I can make you more popular than Jesus, not even just Elvis, but Jesus.
And tell us about some of the other clues that you see in the music, in his writings, that indicate that this transaction had taken place.
Well, like I said, some of the clues were knowingly put there by the Beatles, and those are well documented in many books, hundreds of books that I've read, and this is nothing new. Anybody that is a Beatle fan, or maybe people who aren't even Beatle fans, see these things. But what touched the nerve with me were those clues that could not have possibly been put there by the Beatles, unless they, or John Lennon, was himself a prophet. Now, a prime example of a clue in which you would have to be a prophet is from the Magical Mystery Tour album. And this, again, anyone interested is welcome to go to the LennonProphecy.com site, and there's clues that I show on that website. Now, John Lennon in the movie The Magical Mystery Tour is walking out of a ticket office, and in the background is a sign that says the best way to go is by M&D-C, which, of course, we know the best way to go is by Mark David Chapman. Now, that's an example. People, opponents to this, or people in opposition will say, well, M&D Coaches is a transportation company in England, but M&D Coaches, it doesn't say that. The picture is cropped off to say M&D-C. So that would be one that, unless John Lennon or the others were prophets themselves, how could they possibly have put that clue in there?
Okay, and you're saying they put that clue in there as opposed to it's just a coincidence that that's how the shot came out?
Well, like I said, I've given up on the word coincidence. There's too many aspects of this that you cannot just write off as a coincidence. Looking at that alone, okay, maybe that's a coincidence, they say. But you put this together, and that's just one of many.
Okay, but now let's say that there's a difference maybe between putting in clues as to his own demise. How does that signal to you a deal with the devil?
Well, these clues had to be coming from somewhere.
Okay.
They had to be coming from somewhere.
All right. William is in Amsterdam, Holland, for Joe Niezgoda, the Lennon prophecy on the wild card line. William, I know you've been hanging on for a while, so we'll let you be first up.
Yeah, hi, Ian. Hey, Joe. How you doing?
I'm fine.
Well, the first thing I have to say is, George is absolutely correct that there is no such thing as coincidence. And I think a lot of your listeners know that you're dealing with something. Joe knows what he's talking about. I don't really know how deeply I could get into it, but I just know for a fact that he's correct. I was born in '66 when supposedly, the original Paul McCartney was murdered. But, I don't know how that connects into what Joe's talking about, but I do think it's all connected because I think this is about witchcraft and it's about whatever words you want to use, packed with the devil, but this has to do with sorcery, in other words. It has to do with major sorcery on a global scale. And if you look at everything, you can look at the clues, just like Joe says. And, everything's laid out on a checkerboard square of black and white.
Okay.
And if you look throughout the Beatles, but my basic question is what I'm trying to say is everything seems all weird and creepy, but when you really flush it all out, a guy like Joe is really making sense of this because, I'm in Holland here, which was the setting of Dr. Faustus. And this thing about the devil keeps coming up in my life. So all I know is the devil, whoever or whatever that is, this all seems to dovetail into things that your guests like David Icke talk about.
Okay.
Things,
right.
So
all
I
right,
just
thank
hope
you,
we can
William.
tie some of this together. Yeah.
All right, appreciate that. Let's go to Arthur.
I'd like to address one thing about that caller, which is true.
Sure.
These things, like I said, this book did not start out as a book. This was just a guy, myself, that was interested in researching this because I was fascinated with the Beatles. I wanted to be a part of the Beatles. How better to do that than to read books and get to know them? These things came to me. Like I said, I do not have ties with Satan. I do not have a hot phone line to heaven on this stuff. But I just opened my mind, and these things, I dare use the word channel. People use the term destiny, or they might say a calling. Well, it turns out that this, for whatever reason, seems to be my calling to write this book. It was my destiny.
Right.
And it took 15 years. I had plenty of time to turn away from it.
Arthur is in Ohio on Coast to Coast AM for Joe Niezgoda, author of The Lennon Prophecy. Arthur?
Hi, how you doing, Ian? Listen, I'm a writer. I dug some stuff up on John Lennon a couple of weeks ago that has never been heard in the world. Yoko Ono convinced John Lennon to not have a bodyguard. That is why he was murdered. Yoko Ono, if there was a pact with the devil, she has it. She is very much alive at the age of 75 right now. I don't know. It may be news to the world, but I dug it up on the internet.
Okay.
No, he is correct. It is true that Yoko, for inexplicably, canceled John's bodyguard for some reason. It's true.
Okay. All right. Matthew is in Medford, Oregon on Coast to Coast AM for Joe Niezgoda, author of The Lennon Prophecy. Matthew, did John Lennon make a deal with the devil?
I'm not really sure, but it's from what I've been doing some research on the web, and I don't know what to think, really. But my question is, did the CIA have anything to do with his death?
Did the CIA have anything to do with his death? Joe?
Well, I'll tell you, I've read many things about the CIA and, any of the books that have come out. And, again, this topic, this is probably 20 books rolled into one because it goes off on numerology, it goes off on Satanism, Christianity, and also in governments. And so I did not really go down that particular avenue. But, yes, I have read where the CIA was involved. But, again, that's just like a theory, which is what I'm putting out here, a theory. But I didn't go down that avenue.
Now, how do you put in context what they refer to as John Lennon's born-again Christian phase? Christianity Today wrote about this. There was some discussion earlier this year that he had a period where he talked very highly about the philosophy of Jesus and how he saw the work of the Beatles as all being sort of, in harmony with that philosophy, with that theology. Where are you with that?
I have no idea what you're talking about, to tell you the truth. I mean, like I said, I read many things. I haven't seen anything where, I know that he, like he said, he was into peace, and people like to link that with, Christianity because it is a common belief or a common thread. But, I mean, anything that I've ever read from him was always anti-Christian. I mean... Really?
You never saw the other stuff? Okay.
No.
All right. If you Google that, interesting stuff will come up for you on that subject. I don't know how you'll put it in context of the book, but I just thought I'd offer that to you.
Well, John Lennon's whole life was spent talking about Christianity, the occult. He was very much into the occult. Freddie Seaman's book. It's documented. Like I said, I put nothing in here. I made up nothing. Everything I did, I really, ad nauseum researched to the point where I referenced all these things that I'm saying.
Oh, I understand that. If you're interested, you might just put in John Lennon's Born Again phase and see whether that article pops up or some others that are like it. Joan is in Chicago on Coast to Coast AM for Joe Niezgoda. Joan?
Hi, how are you guys?
Hi, the Lennon prophecy. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, ever since I was in college in the early 70s, and ever since he sang Imagine, anti-Christian, anti-heaven, imagine there's no heaven. I was suspicious of all his writings. But I listened to a number of his albums, and I used to like the Shaved Fish album. And I believe that the Number 9 Dream, followed by the Christmas song with Yoko and the Kids, are definitely hit towards his predicting his own death. And I've never gone as far as you have in trying to say it's Satanism. But in the Number 9 Dream, someone calls out his name, he turns and he's in Alala, land.
Right.
And then the following song in Christmas, he sings the main verses, but he does not sing the Christmas chorus with Yoko and the children, which I always thought was like a clue. The ninth, the ninth was the street. It was around Christmas, December 9, and it was, to me, that all hinted of that.
Thank you, Joe.
I don't know what you think.
All right, go ahead, Joe. What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting because this caller is this is who this book was written for. We're trying to sort this out. It's always been out there. It's a mystery. It started out as a puzzle. I started putting these pieces together, but a puzzle you can solve. This is a mystery that we'll probably never be able to solve but the thing is about mysteries unsolved, they grow more fascinating as time passes. And I mean, something keeps beckoning us to re-examine and pore over the evidence and the clues. And that's just what this last caller's been doing, just as I have. And what I'm trying to do is try to make sense of this. They say Mark Chapman was a deranged murderer. Well, I think there's more to it than that.
What do you mean by that?
And the fact that she brings up Number 9, the Number 9 Dream, that is absolutely, in my opinion, a prophecy of his own death. Okay. That song was originally titled So Long. That was the original working title, So Long.
So when you say Mark David Chapman wasn't, what do you mean by that? You sort of implied that there was something more to it than other than him being crazy.
Well, anybody that, I've read a lot of books, and one of the better books that I've read was Let Me Take You Down by Jack Jones, where he spent a great deal of time with Mark David Chapman. Mark David Chapman, people that knew him, his parents, and people, his work associates, were aghast. They couldn't believe it was Mark. They just couldn't believe that he had the ability to do what he did. And he made no qualms about it, that he felt he was possessed by demons, and that demons drove him to this. Now, I got to be careful because, like I said, as a Beatle fan, I know how Beatle fans are, and they're going to be saying, well, this guy's writing this book standing up for Chapman. Look, Chapman is a murderer. He's where he belongs, in Attica State Prison. He killed John Lennon. I understand that. But it's more than just a deranged guy. It seems to me, and he actually had, it's documented where he had an exorcism performed on him in Attica State Prison where these demons were driven out. Now, this isn't me saying that. This is all documented. And if you don't believe in exorcisms, well, that's fine. But Mark David Chapman did.
Right. Let's see. First-time caller line. John is in Rhode Island on Coast to Coast AM. John?
Yeah, hi, Ian. I have a question, but I'd like to just make a little comment concerning this whole theory first.
Don't have a lot of time, so you have to be brief on that.
I just want to say, first of all, I haven't heard anything that would even vaguely give a case for anything involving Satanism so far. It's just so far-fetched that I don't even grasp what he's getting at. But a previous caller mentioned John's involvement with Christianity, and I'm a Beatle fan of many years, and one thing I do know is that he was always spiritually oriented and the fact is he studied with the Maharishi, which wasn't Christianity, but it was certainly all about spirituality and, Christian values. So why would somebody who's so devoted to the devil want to become involved in, Eastern spirituality? It doesn't make any sense.
All right, John, we'll leave that there. And Joe Niezgoda, the book is The Lennon Prophecy. And so for Beatles fans out there, you can also link up to him through his website and find out more about the case there. Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. I knew it would be a lively time on the phones, and it was.
Okay, Ian, thank you very much. And I would like to say that anyone's welcome to go to thelennonprophecy.com, and they might be interested in what they find there.
Okay, well, they can link up to that, like I said, through the coasttocoastam.com website. And they might be interested, too, in the book that's coming up next, Target Patton. The plot to assassinate General George S. Patton. Will lay out the case with the historian Robert Wilcox. Absolutely fascinating next on Coast to Coast AM. So we're trying to find music by anybody who's written a song about General George S. Patton. Couldn't. I was trying to find anything that I could find that was related to Assassination and George Patton. Couldn't. So I got as close as I could with that there, and the opening theme there being Tenderness by General Public. Figuring that I couldn't get one about General Patton, I'd get General Public. Well, all right, that's as close as I'm going to get, but that's not nearly as close as Robert Wilcox gets to the truth. In the plot to assassinate General George S. Patton. This is a well-researched book that makes the case as clearly as it can be made here in the rearview mirror of history of exactly what happened that day and why, who were the players involved, what was supposed to have happened when George S. Patton was involved in a car accident in his limousine, and then what happened in the hospital afterward. Robert Wilcox has talked to some very key players in this drama. He'll talk about that, plus we'll explain some of the more amazing aspects of this story that involves well-known people and well-known events that you will never think of in the same way again, because this is going to be an amazing show tonight. The target was Patton. Robert Wilcox is next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Robert Wilcox, with the exception of probably the last, 22 pages. I've read every page of your book.
Terrific. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Oh, it was a labor of love. I was getting into it because I was, being a responsible talk show host, but I was upside down, and I thought it was really cool. And you gave a lot of information in here, which I hope you'll join me in hoping to shape for the radio audience, because you go into such great detail in the book, and especially for people who are really looking for the ways in which you, as best you can, cross your T's and dot your I's on this. We'll leave a lot of that to the reading of the book for others. But if you follow me here on this, let me help you paint with some broad strokes what life was like just toward the tail end of World War II. And then afterward, when it came to sort of the public's perception of the Soviet Union, because this is very key to understanding the assassination of George S. Patton. If it did happen, it happened because of this. And I think that so many of us who are born during the Cold War or after the Cold War, we only see the Russians through that lens. And there was a time when there was a rosier picture being painted of Stalin and the Soviet Union. And I think we need to start there just so people understand that's kind of where the country was, or at least a part of it was.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And first of all, they were our allies in defeating the Germans. So everybody, was sort of behind them. They were helping us and so on. But more importantly, I think that the administration at that time, which was Roosevelt throughout the war, that was a Democratic administration, and then it continued that way with Truman right after it. They were really pro-Russian even before the war, and to say it right off the bat, the Russians were very how would I say, mean and rough and tough.
Yeah.
And Stalin
they were
ran
brutal and murderous. I mean, it wasn't always being reported that way in the United States.
Absolutely not. The New York Times reporter who was stationed in Moscow just absolutely, he was a follower of Stalin and didn't report the gulags, didn't report any of the bad things that were going on. It was just a rosy picture. And so we thought that they were great people, and you know, they had spies, so many spies all through our administration even. It got so bad that they almost, if Henry Wallace, who was a vice president for with FDR up until his last term, if he'd have been the vice president when FDR died, he was going to appoint a couple of spies to his cabinet.
Now, do you think he knew? I mean, I think it's very interesting, and you do go down that road a little bit, that of people that were in the Roosevelt administration who were linked to espionage, who were very likely, if they weren't formally spies, they were certainly acting as spies. Do you think that Wallace knew the people the people he spoke about highly in the Roosevelt administration? Do you think he really knew that they were Soviet spies?
No, I do not. I think he was a dupe. He was a do-gooder, you know, a guy who really believed that if we all got together and held hands, that the world would be a better place, and we all want that, of course, but it's not true to human nature, and he just couldn't see it. He was just
I don't want to get too far into Henry Wallace, but your point is taken. Though there was some very strong pro-Soviet feelings both in the press and in the government, but some of that, and you're better to address this than I am. Some of this was based on the idea that the enemy of your enemy is your friend, and whether we like it or not, we have to work with the Soviets to defeat the Nazis.
Oh, absolutely, and that was a legitimate thing, and we did, and they did. They were a key part in defeating the Nazis. But as George Patton began to say, we have liberated Europe from one scourge, but we've given them a worse scourge, and that's what leads us into George.
Right. So let's talk about that. And again, we're just painting some broad strokes here for Target Patton, the plot to assassinate General George S. Patton, that he was a lone voice in this anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, anti-Stalin position in an administration, and at the time would have been an allied government, right, of military leaders who were trying to keep this coalition together of the U.S., the British, and the Soviets. And Patton just he was a thorn in their side on the whole Russian part.
He was. He was just an anti-communist. He was prescient. He saw what they were going to do and believed that it was no good, and he just kept agitating to that. And it was a problem, but it was far-sighted. He saw the Cold War. He saw what was going to become of it, and he wanted to fight the Russians. And that was the worst thing of all in the eyes of his superiors, because not only were they our allies, but FDR really loved them. He called Stalin Uncle Joe, and he really thought that Stalin had good intentions and that the Russians were going to be needed after the war to ensure peace. And so he would not allow any kind of condensation. And this came right down through...
No, I'm listening. Go ahead. I was just agreeing.
Through Patton's superiors, which were very few, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dwight Eisenhower, and these men ahead of him, they didn't want to hear anything about how bad the Russians were.
You know, and yet, when you said that he predicted the Cold War, I would say, just even based on reading your book, that he was predicting a hot war, too. He thought that we were going to end up still rolling tanks against the Soviet Union, so we might as well keep the tanks rolling now, and that there were a lot of people in Czechoslovakia and Poland that were directly appealing to Patton, saying, help us get the Russians out now. Get the Russians out of Germany. Get them out of Eastern Europe. Get them back to Russia, or they're going to own us. They're going to enslave us. And Patton wanted and had spoken openly about going to war himself, almost willing to do it by himself or drag the United States into a war with Russia if necessary.
You're absolutely right. What I meant to really say was he could have prevented the Cold War by that hot war that you so ably corrected me on. Yes, he wanted to go to war. He was even keeping German but a lot of German battalions that he thought we could use and to go against them. And he wanted to go. He wanted to continue the war and of course nobody wanted that. I mean, even that was just a terrible thought, World War III. But he wanted to go right in there, roll right in, and we could have beaten them at that time.
Right. Yeah, but I think that I want you to explore that a little bit more because you hint at that in the book and you talk a little bit about it. Did Patton or did he not have former Waffen SS troops under his wing, or at least somewhere in his pocket, that he could bring out and actually use against the Russians if he were going to put together an attack force, which is what he'd been hinting at?
Yes, he did. He had not a large force.
Wow.
But, but listen to this. He also, to give him his due, he had repatriated and sent back, which is one of the things that infuriated him. He had sent back so many other Germans, gotten rid of them. The charge was that he was in some way pro-Nazi, which was ridiculous. He just didn't believe after the war that every Nazi was a card-carrying, SS member. And his job, ironically, at the end of the war, he should have been fighting Japanese, but they made him a governor. And so he was in charge of getting things working again, getting the sewers working and getting the garbage picked up. And so who did he pick? He picked people who knew how to do that, the former garbage collector, and some of them were Nazis. And he was wrongly charged that he was pro-Nazi. That's not true, but he did keep some crack units that would have been added to ours, because once the war was over, George Patton was a fair and square American. He said, I hated every dirty Nazi and I killed everyone, and he did. He killed more than anybody else in our army for sure. But once it was over, the guys who were not card-carrying Nazis, the goose steppers and so on, he said, we'll just, not be so hard on them. And so he did keep some. Yes, he did.
Which is part of the threat that Patton presented to Eisenhower, to Roosevelt. And I think it's interesting if we're going to look at the assassination of George S. Patton, with as broad a view as possible, we have to start with that notion that if it's a crime that was committed, then it had to have a motive, it had to have a weapon, and there had to be the opportunity. And we'll explore that as we continue to go on. And what we're talking about here is motive, that George S. Patton had a strong anti-Soviet, anti-Stalin position, had been saber-rattling for more war, made it be known that he was ready to roll tanks tomorrow, and this is part, Robert, you can talk about this, where he had a history of just doing these things on his own, where even Ike or Roosevelt could say, absolutely do not do X, and if Patton felt like it was necessary, he went and did X, and he forced their hand many times at Allied command.
He did do that. He was a guy who if he had been through combat. He was the best statistician and tactician there was. Eisenhower was not. Eisenhower was terrible. He was a diplomat, and Eisenhower made many mistakes. And Patton would say, "This is ridiculous." The most famous of all is when he's finally allowed to go into Germany. He should have been allowed months earlier. He captures Trier, which is a large stronghold, and but an order came down from Eisenhower: don't go after Trier unless you have 2 divisions. You don't have 2 divisions, so don't do it. And he calls back and says, "Well, what do you want me to do? Give it back?" I mean, he did that kind of thing, and certainly it angered them.
Well, and he did it in France. He did it in Italy. He would do things. They were sometimes impetuous, but he was a field commander, and this is what he would see. This is what needed to be done in the field, and he did it. And he had very few failures with that type of an impulse. Would you not say he had a pretty good batting average?
He was terrific. Nobody had ever been anything like him, and it wasn't just impulsive. He was a scholar. He was a student. He knew everything about the enemy. He knew everything about the battle area where he was, and he would make these great decisions. And he literally carried us through there. And, we'll talk about this later, but he made decisions that helped Eisenhower, who had made terrible decisions.
Right. He kind of saved Eisenhower's bacon a bunch of times. But what I meant by the impulsivity part was that he went by intuition. He had that kind of, he even thought of himself as having ESP, didn't he? A little bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there would be moments where he would make a decision which he knew was right, which others, he would have had a hard time explaining why he was doing such a thing, but he knew he could do it, he thought he could do it, and he did it.
Well, I don't want to overdo that in this sense that it was always backed by, it was intuition, absolutely, but it was backed by tremendous study and tremendous knowledge.
Sure.
Yeah.
But the reason I say that is I want to lay out as part of the motive for assassinating Patton is that he had a history of, if he had the opportunity and he had the troops, he would go do something even though the Allied command said, don't do this, which is perhaps why they really did fear that if he had these SS troops in his back pocket and he had his own troops under his command, that he could just take off and go attack Moscow.
He was regarded as a loose cannon. He was, and in higher circles, crazy. I mean, they were so worried about him that this is one of the things that led to it. There's another one, too, if you'd like me to say it.
Well, wait, hold on. You go back to crazy for a second. That they actually had sent psychiatrists under the guise of being a clerk to go observe Patton.
Yes, it happened actually twice. Once in Germany, and once when he came home right after the war in the summer of '45. Marshall was desperate. He said, I got to have this guy checked out, and they were going to send a Navy psychiatrist in there. But it didn't happen because a higher official went there and sort of ran things. And Patton was not crazy, but he had that reputation.
Yeah. Borderline personality, maybe. But But all right, so here he is in the midst of a pro-Soviet, at least pro-socialism, if not pro-communism. Maybe some people in the administration were actual communists and were communist spies, but at least a socialist-friendly administration under Roosevelt. A need for Allied command to keep things together in Europe, and nobody with a taste for further war except for Patton, who has the wherewithal and the history that says it's something that he just might do impetuously, is go start World War III. And they really were worried about that. And that's why, what was the expression that he was Eisenhower's rabid attack dog?
Yes.
Is that what it was?
Yeah, that's. I think Doolittle gave that expression. He used to talk about that.
Meaning what?
Meaning that when Eisenhower needed to get out of a jam, he'd let this dog go, and Patton would clear the field. He could do anything.
Yeah, and then muzzle him afterward. And that may be the first thing we have to know in the assassination of George S. Patton. If it happened because, as any rabid dog in your neighborhood might have to be put down, there was a feeling that the Eisenhower's rabid attack dog might just lead the planet onto a perilous path.
Exactly.
And so this could have been essentially the putting down of the rabid attack dog. We'll talk about it. Robert Wilcox will lay out the case for the plot to assassinate General George S. Patton. And along the way, coming up next, we'll get into the history of the person who says that he did it, that he was centrally involved in the case. He raises his hand to history and says, it was me. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Robert K. Wilcox, the plot to assassinate General George S. Patton. And we're just kind of putting it out there. The idea of first the motive, we established that. And now what about the weapon and the opportunity? And who was it that committed the crime? Well, we'll get into that because Robert Wilcox has talked to the man who said and has written in his diaries about the time when he was involved, how much he did it for, why he did it. And like everybody else, it's a story full of patriotism. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. I love books like this because with every page you turn, you just shut up. You're reading it going, no way. And yet it's a very well-researched book. Robert Wilcox is an author, a journalist, a screenwriter who has appeared on television and whose other books include Screams of Eagles, Japan's Secret War, Wings of Fury, and Black Aces High. Pardon me, I tend to do the show in the dark, Robert, so I'm reading your bio on your book jacket only by the light of my computer screen.
So. You did good.
So I know that this has had. How many years you worked on this? Just out of curiosity, because there's a lot of legwork.
I found out about this 10 years ago. At least I got on the scent of it 10 years ago, and I had to do it piecemeal because as a writer, I have to write other books and so on. But about 3 years ago, why I finally got an advance to write this, and you have to have that to proceed. And then I worked on it full time from then.
Well, it's just it's really well executed. Yet you got some breaks as a writer and a researcher that helped to really flesh out the story. If you hadn't gotten, for example, the time you got with this guy Bezada, you wouldn't have the story that you have.
You're right, and I got it at the right time because this was just a larger than life guy who
talk about him from the very beginning. I made a reference to his last name, but tell how did you come across him, and what's his name and what's his story?
His name is Douglas Bezada, and he is he's just a James Bond and Lawrence of Arabia, and we don't have people like that anymore. But he was an assassin for the OSS. The OSS was the forerunner of the CIA. And they were our first special forces. He was dropped into Nazi Germany right in the midst of the Nazis to organize the Maquis. He was a Jedburgh. That was our first special forces group. And just did incredible things in that war. But earlier than that, I mean, he's the son of a minister, of a Presbyterian, very noted Presbyterian minister on the East Coast, and also his father, as a young man, is one of the great athletes in Southern California. Douglas was a big kid for a young man, and he always wanted adventure. And as a young guy, 17 years old, he shipped out. And in those days, in the 20s and 30s, our Marine Corps was going down into the Latin American places and off of Cuba and so on. And he got into what he always wanted to get into, which he called the clandestine, which is the Secret Service. And they saw him as a big, tough kid, and they sent him on missions. They had him do things. And by the time he's 30 years old, he's got his own spy unit, and he's a very flamboyant guy. And he actually, after the war, as a freelance assassin and a person who did jobs for the CIA and other countries, he masqueraded. His cover was that he was an artist, and he was such a good jet-set artist that Grace Kelly had shows for him, and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor had shows for him, and he knew Salvador Dali, and he was also, his daily job was he was the wine expert, actually one of the managers of the Champagne Mumm family, which is a famous champagne house, and that gave him a base in right at the corner, right at France and Germany. So anyway, he spent a long time doing this, and he was assassin, and this was he had been told early on. I don't know if you want me to get into it right now, but the Stop Patton plot was started by he was told by the head of the OSS, Wild Bill Donovan, to stop Patton. And this was early in the war in 1944, and I think this plot evolved from a stop Patton to a kill Patton. And I got to Douglas when he was 85 years old, and he'd had a stroke, and that all his life he was a clandestine. He never talked about anything. This was part of his part and parcel of what he did. And with this stroke, it kind of brought things out on him, and he didn't care so much. He was also promised that when he did these things for his country, that he would be able to come home and get a great job with the CIA when he was ready to retire. Well, lo and behold, he comes home, and they don't even know who he is. There are no records of what he'd done, and he's shunned out. He does have a few friends. One of his good friends is the former head of the CIA,
William Colby.
William Colby, thank you.
Right. And a fellow Jedburgh, which was a topic we did a couple of years ago with that book that came out called The Jedburghs, and it was fascinating about these elite group of people that jumped behind enemy lines before the invasion of D-Day, et cetera. But there was proof that he was involved in this. I mean, he gets recommendations, he gets letters. I mean, it's not like he's just some guy who says, I did this. I mean, he comes with all the bona fide kind of, it seems like resume to back up his claim.
Oh, absolutely. But, when you say there was proof, well, first of all, when I met him, and I spent a week with him, and he just opened up to me and gave me his diaries and so on, I immediately went to the National Archives because the OSS papers had been opened up, and everything he told me was true. I mean, he's bona fide through there. All of his missions and so on, these were all there. Also, when he came back and tried to get, he's been shot, he's been stabbed, he got about 8 or 9. He's got 100% a disability from the VA, but he had to go before a board. It took him 2 years to write to all the different people that he knew and say, "Will you testify that I was here at that time and got this wound and got shot, doing this stuff for me?" So the upshot of it all is that he was sterling. I mean, this was no fool. This was no liar. And even the people who know him told me Douglas Pizzata never lied. He had a lot of tricks up his sleeve, but he never lied. He did other things. But anyway,
well, let's take a breath there, because I think this is really interesting. Again, we're talking about Douglas Pizzata, a guy who claims to be the one who was asked to set up the assassination of Patton, and he's a guy who was already known to be a killer. Even in the New York Times obituary for him, they talk about him as an OSS officer. The details of that are more fleshed out, obviously, in this new book called Target Patton. We're talking with Robert Wilcox. The story is that Pizzata as an assassin, as I was thinking of him, Robert, I was thinking of him as the character in the Eiger Sanction. Do you ever see the Eiger Sanction or read the book?
I didn't see that.
Okay. It's Clint Eastwood movie. He's a CIA assassin who has the cover of an international artist and wine expert. I mean, it's really close to.
Wow, that is close.
He's an art collector, and he has all this stuff, and he has this very sort of effete image. And I thought of Pizzata on that. But anyway, so here's Pizzata, who opens up to you, who for the first time ever talks about it on the record and says, yeah, I did it. When was he originally contacted, and by whom, to get involved in a plot to stop or kill Patton?
It was in 1944, before he jumped into until he jumped into France. And he jumps right near Patton's armies. But it was he was first brought in and talked to by Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan. And the idea then was just to stop this loose cannon. We need him. We need him to win battles for us, but he can't go any further than we want him to go. And this Stop Patton plot, I found proof of that. There are written records about that. But then the key to Pizzata is he gave me these diaries, and in these diaries it's agonizing, where he agonizes over his life and what he did. And he describes, among other things, these 8 meetings that he had with Donovan, which continue on after the war, and where he then is. There's this special meeting, and this was really a key thing for me, because Donovan is in England, and Donovan is one of the most enigmatic men in the world. I mean, to try to find out where he was, when he was, what he did, it was just the hardest thing in the world, and still is. But in this diary, Pizzata describes going to this meeting, and where they have it's a dinner kind of thing in a quiet place, and Donovan says to him, Douglas, we have a terrible problem. We have a man who is a great, great patriot, but he's just gone too far, and something has to be done. And Bezada doesn't like Donovan, by the way. He found that's another story. But anyway, Bezada kind of plays with Donovan. He goes, "Oh, please, don't worry. I am your man. I am the person who's going to do for you whatever you want." And Donovan says, "Well, it's really bad, and we need to stop this thing." And Bezada says, "Do you mean kill him, sir?" And Donovan looks at him and says, "Well, you have to do what you have to do." And that's the way it's described in the diary.
Right.
And it goes on. And that's after these 8 meetings, which took place over almost 8 or 9 months. And I can't pinpoint exactly when they occurred, but it's roughly that time. And Bezada knew then that he had his orders, and he agonized over that. But then he said, "I bought what they said, and that,
right.
that he needed to be killed."
And Bezada, this guy Douglas Bezada, OSS operative, he was no socialist. I mean, he wasn't part of that kind of East Coast liberal elite or anything that was seeing the Soviet Union as a kind of utopia. He had to have really struggled over the idea of killing somebody that was more cut from the same cloth that he was in George S. Patton.
Absolutely. He actually knew Patton. Patton and he had met it even goes back to his father. Douglas Bezada's father was a great athlete, a football player, a boxer, and George Patton had been at one of his games, one of the father's games, in which the father had stopped the game because something bad had happened and said he was going to take his team off the field. And George Patton respected his father very much. Well, jump to 1930 to 1942. And Douglas Bezada is a weapons expert in North Carolina at one of the big bases. And Patton came in, and they talked about his father and so on. And Patton asked Bezada to be like on his intelligence team. Well, Bezada said, "No way, I'm not going to do that." Bezada does not take orders from anybody. He wants to be on his own and he jump behind the lines and do all that kind of stuff. So he didn't do that. But he knew Patton, and he did agonize over that. And no, he was not a socialist, but he had a weird philosophy. Bezada did.
Well, talk about that, because weird philosophy. Obviously, there's got to be some kind of twist and turn in you to do what he did, and to take, what was it, $10,000 to set this up?
Which would be $100,000 today.
Which made me think, though, that if it were a job like he's in the OSS and the head of the OSS says you got to go do this thing, why is he getting paid?
Because that's just an extra little incentive there. You know, when you get to that level, it isn't just a job 9 to 5.
Right.
They do more for you on that kind of thing.
Okay. I'd never heard of that before. The idea of giving them a cash incentive. I thought, you're in the service. This is what your superior is telling you got to go do. You go do it.
Well, not only that, but Donovan had unlimited money. He was
right.
and he had no strings attached, and he didn't have to report to anyone but FDR.
Might as well share the wealth, I guess. All right. So, and by the way, you say that I interrupted you because you were about to go someplace, but Bezada then said, "Look, I'm a lone wolf," and he had some weirdness to him. You were about to say.
Yeah, I was going to say that you brought up his philosophy. Well, he had a sort of a mentor, and the two of them had actually began this group called the Co-op. It was a group of assassins, of people who would do jobs that the CIA couldn't do, or that the French intelligence couldn't do. They would hire Bezada's group. And it was based in Marseille. And this philosophy was that they were after all bad people in the world, bad people being gun runners, people who fomented war. I wouldn't call Bezada a liberal or a conservative. I would call him just someone who had this weird philosophy that because of what he believed he was going to do things that would help the world, and they actually did they had no compunction of kidnapping a gun runner, and they did so throughout France. And a guy who sold weapons to both sides, a profiteer, a war profiteer, and they would shake him down and get money from him, and in a very brutal way, as a matter of fact. So he had this operation going on, and as far as his philosophy went, he was neither but I would lean him towards not being what you would call liberal, but
no. Not by his quotes and everything. And I only say that because I think that actually kind of adds oddly to his credibility in this case. Because why would he admit to something like this if it weren't true? There was nothing in his story or in his makeup that would put him in the category of somebody who would want to say that he was the one that killed Patton.
No, I agree. And also another factor is, at the end of his life, think of this. You're a man whose greatest skill is killing other people. You've done it as you thought was for your country. But at the end, it began to gnaw on him. And he would, in his diaries, you can read it. It's just agonizing. Lord, why have you given me these skills? Why do I do this? Why am I this type of person? And so there was a great bit of remorse. And I think that I got him at a time when he wanted to talk about this and wanted to justify what he said, what he did.
All right. So let me see if I got this right. And I just hopefully we're laying this out in a way that makes it easy to understand in a radio form. The book, of course, gets into great detail on all of this. Target Patton. But if George S. Patton was murdered, the murderer was the U.S. government and the Allied forces. The motive for the crime was that Patton was a loose cannon who was just about to point that loose cannon at Moscow and was on the verge of creating World War III, had Nazi soldiers that he had squirreled away ready to join him in an all-out attack on pushing the Soviets out of Czechoslovakia and out of Poland, felt justified to do it and had showed a pattern of doing it. That's the motive, to stop Patton.
We've left one thing out.
All right, go ahead.
The Russians were part of it, and Bazada did this with Russian help.
Okay, good point, that the Russians also wanted the U.S. to stop Patton. So that's the motive, stop Patton. The weapon is this guy, Douglas Bazada, who was an OSS officer. Let's think of him as the weapon that makes this happen. So we've talked about the motive, the weapon. Let's talk about the opportunity. And then also the rather bizarre story of the guy who supposedly cranked the truck in front of the oncoming limousine of George S. Patton, or did he? And we'll talk about that next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Kind of a fan of the Soup on E. Like, I'll never be able to think of that song again after what Joel did with that song. That still cracks me up. But that's what essentially we're talking about. Where the book is Target Patton. Robert Wilcox is the author of The Plot to Assassinate General George S. Patton. There was a pervasive feeling toward the end of World War II that Patton was going to either find a way to extend World War II in a battle with the Soviets or create World War III. Just as they thought this one was winding down, just as the Roosevelt administration thought they had found somebody they could work with Joseph Stalin and the USSR. Now, we look back on that and we think, well, that's crazy, and Patton was closer to right than Roosevelt was. Still, the feeling was at the time that he was about to do something which, if they didn't stop him from doing it, would embroil the whole world into another round of war that nobody had taste for. So that's where we were last hour as we talked about the book To Assassinate George S. Patton. In Target Patton, the thought is they had to find a guy, Wild Bill Donovan, head of the OSS, had to find a guy that would be willing to create the circumstances that would make it look like Patton had died as sort of an accident of war. And this is where we'll talk about the actual event itself. What happened that day that Bazada says he arranged for an accident? Who was involved in the accident? And the two very curious people and cases of the drivers involved. What happened to them? And what is it that one guy has left behind in a vault only to be revealed after the death of his attorney. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. And Robert Wilcox, the author of Target, Patton, the author of many other books, and done some really nice research on this, able to find this guy, Douglas Bezada. Now, how was it again that you were told that Douglas Bezada was the one that was the OSS agent that had arranged this? Who told you about that originally?
My cousin has a international detective agency. He does work all over the world. And we were working out one day together, and he happened to mention that he knew the guy. He knew a guy who knew something about the Patton death, and that it was a murder. And I said, "Oh, that's not right. I know that it was an accident." And then he said, "No, it wasn't," according to this guy, Douglas Bezada. And
so he had already been blabbing a little bit.
Yes, he did. When he came back in it wasn't blabbing so much as it was, as I told you, he was very mad about what happened to him when he came back. And in 1979, at a dinner, an OSS dinner, with William Colby at the same table, Bezada arranged to have a newspaper reporter, a Washington, D.C. newspaper reporter there, and ask the question about what happened to Patton. And at that time, he said, "I know what happened to Patton. I didn't do it, but I know who did." And this came out in a Washington paper, and immediately a tabloid called The Spotlight got with him, and Bezada told his story in two parts to this tabloid. This is in 1979. And that was the first time that he said it. And there are reasons why he did that, but then it sort of fell down again, and nobody heard anything more about it. It wasn't the New York Times, and it wasn't the Washington Post.
It was kind of I don't know how to describe it. It was sort of I don't know. I don't want this to sound dismissive, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it sounded a little bit sort of like a John Birch Society kind of tabloid.
It was.
Okay. Was it from the John Birch Society?
It was. I don't know if it was exactly the John Birch Society, but it had a reputation as almost a right-wing radical.
I would put it in that category.
Yeah,
I would, and I would say
it no longer exists.
Yeah, but let's be fair. It was right-wing radical. It was pretty out there, but it wasn't necessarily wrong on this. It just was in the context of other stories, and they had kind of a paranoia a little bit about it that may have kept it from being picked up by the New York Times.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So that's where the story appears. So let's go through the day itself. As you got to know Bezada, Bezada shares with you what he remembers. He gives you his diaries. You look at it. What happened the day that Patton was, in his view, in his claim, assassinated?
Yes. Well, it starts with the accident, and what happened was Patton is sort of banished. It's the day before he is to go home, and it is suggested that he go on a hunting trip. He's in a place called Bad Nauheim, Germany, and he's going to go down 100 miles to the place where they find where they do the shooting. And it's a Sunday morning. It's the last day before he's going to leave the continent. And he's in his Cadillac. It's a 1938 Cadillac, a touring car, a limousine. He has his aide, General Gay, with him in the back seat, and a driver. And at this time, this is December 9th. 1945. There's nothing but ruin in Germany, and they come off of the Autobahn, and they are driving by Mannheim in a little road. It's just a 2-lane highway, and they stop for a railroad, a train, and then they start up, and Patton is in the car, and he's remarking about all the terrible debris on the side of the road. And there's this truck that that the driver sees up ahead of them, and it was parked, and it comes out when they start up. It comes out, which is suspicious itself. And this driver, this truck has either 2 or 3 people in it. That is part of the mystery of this, and they come up very slowly, and Patton's car is gaining speed. They probably go about 300 yards from the railroad track. They're doing something like between 10 and 30 miles per hour. And this truck is just comes up abreast of them almost, and then suddenly, without a signal, and apparently really turning into no place either, although that's debatable, it turns in front of the Patton car. There's no chance to do anything, but the driver does swing his the limousine a little bit to the middle of the road, and there's an impact on the right front fender of the limousine, hits that truck, and it's variously described as a fender bender. It's not a tremendous crash, but when it ends, Patton has broken his neck, and he's laying on top of a Gay. Now, there are no seat belts in this car, and the theory is that he somehow flew through the air. There was a large area in the back of the limousine, maybe 4 or 5 feet, where he could have done that. But nobody saw him do this. Now, I'll back up and say that Bazada says that this was all planned, that the truck was to do this way, and that earlier in the trip, when they had come down from Bad Naum, Patton and the 2 others had stopped the car. They had gone to look at a Roman ruin. Patton loved ruins and loved the ancient cities and so on. And at that point, he had been following them. And by the way, Bazada was stationed very nearby. This was certainly something he could have done. He followed them, he snuck up to the car, and he rolled the window down and stuck something in the window that would keep it from being rolled up. Well, now, when we get to the accident, the window is rolled down, according to Bazada, and at the moment of the crash, he has a specially designed rifle, for lack of a better term, but it doesn't shoot a charge. It's air driven, and it will shoot either a rock or, in this case, a bolt, which would be shot into the car. And he says that he shot it right into Patton's face. Patton does, when he gets to the hospital, have a tremendous bad gash in the middle of his face. It's almost like a flap of skin from his nose all the way to the midway of his head, and it's bloody and everything else. But when that crash occurs, and suddenly this area, which is very remote, a vast array of military people come there. There's a brigadier general. There are MPs. There finally comes an ambulance, which takes Patton not to a hospital. And by the way, no one else in the accident is hurt. Only Patton. It takes Patton, this ambulance, to about 30 miles away to a hospital. And he's admitted. And should I go on from here?
Well, I think this is the interesting part. By all means, you will in a moment. But let's just back up and amplify. So part of this. So the truck turns. This truck cranks in front of the limousine. The limousine smacks into it, and there's
either no signal.
Right, and there's General Gay, right, the other guy that's in the back there,
yes.
And he's unhurt.
He's unhurt.
Okay, and then the other companion, the other aide, is unhurt, and the only person that's hurt is Patton. And so Bazada says he just walked calmly up to it, or was he stationed in the bushes? No. How did he fire this air compressed bolt at Patton's face?
Patton is actually, and this is from Gay years later when he did a memoir. Patton is actually talking about the stacks of broken cars and planes, and they are stacked along the side of the road. Bazada said he was behind one of those stacks. And at the moment of the crash, and by the way, there are 2 trucks involved. They have another truck on the side of the road, so that when the truck that turns in front of Patton hits him or stops him from going one way, if Patton's car tried to go around it, there would be a stationary truck which would prevent that. So in effect, Bazada had set up a killing lane, and he is behind a bunch of this ruin, so he's neatly concealed behind there.
How far away when he fires the air compressed rifle that sends that bolt at Patton's face?
25 feet.
So a shot he could make.
A shot he could certainly make, and by the way, he is a world-class shot.
All right, and so the fact that afterward, if they found a bolt sitting in the back seat, that would just not have been caught anybody's attention.
Not at all.
And so a bullet, yes, obviously you couldn't use a bullet, but by doing that, it looks like an accident. And it should be said that there was a history of these types of accidents that are documented, OSS operative, espionage-like accidents. This happened a lot.
Absolutely. It was probably the best way to do it, and the CIA has a document which talks about this being probably the best way to do this. And, of course, the Russians did the same thing, because what it does is it looks like an accident. It isn't going to be investigated much, and also if you screw up like they did, and Bazada always in his diary says, I didn't kill him because we screwed it up. We didn't kill him there, and you can.
But he still kept the money.
Yeah, he still kept the money. You can go to the hospital, and then you have another situation which is easier even then, because a patient laying in a hospital room can easily be killed with all, and that was the beginning of these poisons that would mimic natural deaths. Right,
and so the thought is, and we may never know who actually, because it wasn't Bazada. But that Bazada's part was done, and I want to talk more about the two drivers involved here in just a moment. But his part was done, but Patton then goes to the hospital, and this is where I interrupted you, and later on dies from clotting in his blood.
But he gets so well. I mean, this is a tough guy. He gets to the point where they're going to send him home. He has recovered to that extent. He's got a broken neck, but some of the feeling is coming back. He's doing terrifically, and then he has a sudden downturn, very suspicious, and dies from what they said was a blood clot, but no autopsy, and there are poisons that could make it be a blood clot.
And he suspected that he was going to be killed. There were others who said that he said he was going to be killed. I mean, that's the other piece to this, is if he is assassinated, the last person who'd be surprised by it would be Patton.
Yeah, he actually told his daughters when he was on that trip back home in the summer that they would never see him again, that he was going to die over there. And my wonder is, was it because Bazada told me that he actually he warned Patton that there were people out to get him. This is during those 8 meetings where they're after him, they want to stop him, and this kind of thing. So he knew, I think. And
that was weird that Bazada tipped to Patton. And I'm not quite sure in the end, as I read his diary entries on that in the book Target Patton, that I believe him.
Well, I do, because, you see, what's going on with that is that it took a long time for Bazada to overcome his reluctance to do this. He didn't mind stopping Patton, but when it finally came to kill Patton, that was a tough call for him. And in the diaries, in my opinion, and you really have to read all of them and see all the. I didn't quote every one of them, but in my mind, I buy that. I buy his gradual believing of this.
Well, and it's the part about warning. I would just think he was too experienced to warn his prey, and there's something about that just. But okay, fair enough. So here we've established the motive. We established the weapon, Douglas Bazada from the OSS, the opportunity. They created this, and then you have the case where later on, and somehow, whether it's the Soviets, and this could have been something that the Soviets could have done, they might have come in and finished him off with the blessing of Wild Bill Donovan. It might have been another OSS agent. Who knows? But Patton, just before he's about to be sent home, just as he's recovering, just as it looks like this broken neck just might heal after all, and he'd be okay, he dies. So then he's shipped back home, and there's like hardly any investigation whatsoever, and that is also strange.
Well, there were a couple, and the thing is that all of the reports on the accident and the investigations, 8 or 9 of them, well, not that many, but just about that many, are gone, missing. It's a cover-up.
Okay, so what was investigated, we'll never know. We don't see it, and it's gone right away. When did the first historians try to find the the records?
Well, early on they did, and they were already gone.
So it's not like they were gone by the mid-'70s. They were gone in the late 40s, early 50s.
Yes,
they were already gone.
If he was assassinated, they did a good job, and they did it quickly.
Okay. So then the cover-up begins, and yet certain things leak out. And that brings us to the two drivers. Not the driver of the limousine, but the driver of the truck who cranked the truck in front of Patton. How was he involved? Did he ever indicate what he had done? Was he paid off? What's his story? And then the intriguing, I find it very intriguing story of the guy that was in the chase car, essentially in the Jeep in front of Patton's limousine, who seems like he was in on it from the get-go. And we'll talk about that next with historian Robert Wilcox, writing this cool book on Patton, Target Patton, on Coast to Coast AM. So there you go. That's what I was kind of thinking of Bezzata, Douglas Bezzata, playing that bumper. Interesting guy, the guy who admits to, while being a great patriot and somebody who believed very much in America, also believed that sometimes you had to do wet work like this in the killing of George S. Patton. And that's one of the main characters in this true story of Target Patton, Robert K. Wilcox. We'll get to your questions and comments coming up next hour. But we got to get to the curious case of the two drivers involved. The one guy who is driving the Jeep in front of Patton's limousine, the guy who was leading Patton to the place where they were going to go pheasant hunting that morning. And then the guy that turned the truck. What do we know about these two people? Or what do we think we know? And what is still waiting to be told in a locked safety deposit box? We'll get to that next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So, Robert Wilcox, let's set the stage for what happened before the truck accident. There was a guy who is almost unknown to history because they kept getting his name wrong, who was driving the Jeep that was leading Patton to the area where they're going to go pheasant hunting. And then there was the guy inside the truck. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think the truck first, because just because that's where it started. But Robert L. Thompson is the guy who turns the truck in front of Patton. He has just injured critically the highest-ranking officer in Europe at the time, and the great American icon George Patton, and basically he disappears. He just there are no records of him, and as I did my research, I was able to find out somewhat of what happened to him, and it turned out that he was a guy who was sort of a black marketeer in those days. Bezzata says that he took those guys from the motor pool because they had access to the truck, had given them some booze and some money, didn't tell them who they were going to do this to, but told them what to do, and on his signal, they were to do that. That is, the truck was to come out when they saw that car. But this guy, he vanishes, and you've got to wonder, well, wait a minute, why don't they have him here? Why isn't he in the newspapers every day? He's gone. And when I tracked down him to get ahead of the story, it turns out that he's gone home. His family doesn't even like him. He's a philanderer. He had a lot of money that he couldn't bring back from Germany. Where did he get that money?
Right.
And he never told really anybody about this. The family was never allowed to talk about what had happened with Patton. And but a friend of his, a lawyer, which I finally ran into, told me that there was this big secret about him that he knew, the lawyer knew, and that the lawyer will never tell. Once he dies, he'll give it to one of his nephews,
relatives, right?
Relatives, and they can do with it what they want. But I said, he said, I will not divulge this until someone accuses him of killing Patton, and I just don't know what this thing is. When I told Thompson's family about it, they'd never heard about it. They want to find out what it is, so I'm just not sure what that is. But the fact that he vanished, and one of the things I left out was Another piece that I found out from this lawyer was that he was whisked away to London. Why would they take someone, just a common, soldier, no big deal, take him to London? The lawyer didn't know what happened to him after there, but even that is so suspicious.
Yeah, but I thought there was one explanation that was reasonable in that they yanked him out of there because there was fear there might be retaliation. Patton being so loved that there might be some, all it takes is a couple of guys with a couple of beers, and they're going to go find the guy who did it and pummel him. So, I mean, that made sort of sense. That made sort of sense.
Reasonable, except that Patton was not really known at that. He was not going to die at that moment. He hadn't been killed.
Right.
And so.
And it looked like an accident. I mean,
an accident. Yeah.
Right. It wasn't like he was drunk and he was firing a gun. But the thing is that he might have been drunk is a very interesting idea. That he made some comment, or other people said he was on some sort of beer run or something, and he had commandeered this vehicle and he was drunk. What do you know about that?
Well, there are indications that's true. We have a photograph of him at the scene, one of the few pictures of the scene at all. And it shows him in a goofy pose, and it looks like he's sort of, I don't know, a clown or something.
Yeah, it is weird. It doesn't seem to represent the sobriety of the moment.
No, it doesn't. And so he may very well, and Posada says that he gave him liquor, and that may very well have been the situation. To me, it's all very strange. He vanishes. Nobody talks to him. He's just like Posada says he was, that they'd give him something to drink. It all adds up. And then when he goes home, there's this guy who's just a real creepy guy who would have done something like this. And the story of him, of course, gets even worse. But it's no fault of his, I don't think. But his wife is murdered.
Right.
You don't know what that's about.
No, but. Yeah, but he's got this weird mojo. It's not. He obviously didn't have anything to do with his wife being murdered. She was killed in the shop that they were running. But there's just something about him. He's hinky, and there's just something about him that almost gets a feeling that he's bad news. And his kids knew about that. They knew there was something wrong with Dad, and that Dad was kind of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that their dad, even in the States, was always up to something.
Always, all three of them said that. Even to hear the children talk, these are adults now, to hear them talk about their dad this way. The oldest son called him a dog because he tried to fix up the son with one of the girls that he was cheating on his wife with. This guy, like you say, bad mojo. There's just a lot of bad stuff about him.
Yeah, and this thing about his lawyer, I think this is a really interesting thing that it's almost as though there was a cash opportunity that this guy Thompson, who turned the truck into the oncoming limousine of Patton, timed it perfectly so that there was no way for the Patton limousine to be able to react, and they weren't going that fast. So he turns the truck right in from the oncoming path. He seems drunk. Posada says he got the guy drunk, and he is always sort of this font of mysterious cash in his army life, and always willing to do something for a buck. And he does this, and I think this is the part that's just really key. He doesn't seem to show any remorse at all.
No.
He's like, I'm golden. It almost had this sort of like, let the party begin kind of an atmosphere to him.
Well, that's very true. That's what happened with him, and he is a mystery and is part of this story in Target Patton. I can't say much more about it except to go on with this bad mojo.
Yeah. And what the lawyer has in that safety deposit box, it may or may not say, I was paid by the CIA or the OSS to do it. It may not say that, but whatever it says, it's just weird that they won't come out with it, whatever it is.
Very weird. And there's nothing you can do about it. That's the way it is at this point. Maybe something will happen with it.
All right. Now that brings us, and I interrupt you from talking about Joe Spruce/Scroose, who was leading them on a wild spruce chase, you might say, as Patton was in the limousine following this guy to go pheasant hunting.
He is the Jeep and the sergeant who is carrying all the rifles and the dog that is going to help them when they go into this bird hunt. And he's right ahead of them. So he has a chance to see everything that's going on, or he's a signal. We don't know. But the funny thing is that once the crash happens, he doesn't come back. Now, this is a sergeant leading, again,
a general.
And the highest-ranking general in Europe. and the great icon Patton, but he doesn't return to the scene.
I mean, so there's an accident, and this guy's in a Jeep with the guns and the dog, and he just keeps on driving.
And he was close enough to have heard the accident. That's a fact, but he keeps on driving.
But even if you don't hear it, at some point if your rear view mirrors are broken and you get to the place where you turn around and nobody's there, don't you turn around and go find out what happened to him? They might have had a flat tire. They might have blown a radiator. Who knows?
Exactly. And anyway, I found, with the aid of my cousin, the detective, and some of his people, I found his daughter, who had no idea about any of this. All she knew was that her father had died in a mysterious way, and that he was a military clandestine. It appeared. We really don't know for sure, but he had a job just like Bazada did. When Bazada came back, he got a job. They did give him one on it was actually a pheasant ranch near the CIA headquarters. It was obviously a place where, a safe house, and Bazada ran it. Well, Joe Scrucy, which is his real name, and which was always covered up. Anyone who ever went to look and research in this story, and there weren't many, would find his name as Spruce, but his real name, that was a mistake, and we don't know why that happened, other than maybe somebody put it out that way.
And purposely sort of left the trail cold, because everybody went looking for this guy, Joe Spruce, who is supposedly in the Jeep in front of Patton, and he was never there. It was Joe Scrucy.
Very convenient.
Right, spelled very similarly, and that he ends up essentially as CIA.
Yes, it appears that's what he was, and he was in the same kind of job, and he was a great marksman and so on, and he died a strange death. I can't say it was what it was, but I I can't say it was murder.
Oh, it's bizarre.
But it's a bizarre death.
Tell the story that his daughter tells of about how her father died, and why her daughter for his daughter, you helped put some of the pieces together.
Yes, she didn't know much about she didn't know anything about Patton or anything like that. But she knew her father had been in the Army and had died this strange death. And when I say the strange death, he had told his wife, while he's this spy, he's this clandestine on the Army base, and what he does is he runs a kind of retreat where generals and so on would come, and he would cook for them. He would shoot game for them. Well, this is in 1952, and she's a little baby, but her mother told her this story that several weeks before his birthday, his wife was saying, I'm going to have a birthday for you, and we're going to have a big time. And he said, no, I don't want to do anything. I'm not going to be around much longer. And she said, she got all upset. Why are you telling me this? Why are you saying? He said, oh, well, don't worry about it, because he was older than she was, and I guess he treated her with kid's gloves.
Right,
gloves.
Maybe a little patronizing.
Yeah.
Didn't tell her the whole. But just would have intoned that he was not going to live past his birthday.
Exactly, and sure enough, on the date of the birthday, all he asked for was to make love with his wife and have ice cream and cake. And they were in the bedroom, and suddenly he starts having hemorrhaging, and he has this horrible hemorrhaging with blood coming out of his ears, and the guy was in perfect fitness. And we actually, his daughter and I were able to get records that showed there was nothing in his medical record to say this was going to happen. What is this? Is this some sort of suicide, or they're going to kill him this way and he knows it? I don't know. I don't have that. I can't say that. But it's a bizarre ending to this man's life.
And so, again, here's the guy who's in the Jeep in front of Patton, who never turns around after the accident, drives off into history. It ends up being rediscovered years later as you find the pieces put back together that he worked for the CIA, worked for the Army, stayed in this sort of nefarious business, and he tells his young wife, I'm going to essentially die on my birthday, and he lays out for her how he's going to die. Explain what he wanted his day to be like.
Well, he just wanted a nice day. He wanted.
Well, no, the whole thing about it: feed me birthday cake in bed and make love to me, and then I'm not going to be around much longer.
Yeah,
basically,
that's basically what it was, and so we're left with this mystery.
I mean, she feeds him birthday cake and coffee in bed. They start to make love, and he immediately gets ill.
Yeah.
And he goes to the hospital and dies of was it a brain hemorrhage?
It's apparently that's what it is. It's a brain hemorrhage where there's blood everywhere, and he died. And then years later, along comes Bob Wilcox to his daughter, and are you this daughter of so and so? And yes. And then I told her this whole story, and she went, "Oh my God, I've always known something was strange about what had happened." And she is not named in the book. I had to use a pseudonym.
A pseudonym, right?
Because she was a little afraid about it all.
I guess I wouldn't blame her. I mean, think about what happened. So these are the players, and now in the end, we have the motive, we have the weapon, we have the opportunity, we have what appears to be, the sort of downward pressure on Patton to not ever be able to make it back to the United States. What do you think would have happened if Patton had survived that crash, if he had survived the treatment in the hospital, if he had never been involved, if they had never attempted to assassinate Patton? What would have happened if Patton had made it back to the U.S.? This is very key.
Patton would have, he had two things. He knew secrets also. This is another part of the motive that we haven't gone into. He knew secrets that really would have stopped Dwight Eisenhower, for instance, from becoming president. He was going to write a tell-all book, which he eventually did publish a book called War as I Knew It, but it was heavily edited, but he never got a chance to finish that. But more importantly, there was actually a movement in America for him to be a president, to be a presidential candidate. He was number 3 or 4 in a popularity poll that they had. He definitely could have run for president, but he probably wouldn't have. I don't think that was really his design, but he easily could have also been a senator, if not elected president. I think mainly he was going to go back and tell secrets, and he would have been the most public voice against the Russians. And maybe he would have changed our policy because he was a very popular figure, hated by some, loved by many.
Well, he would have gone on, at very least, what you're saying is he would have gone on a lecture tour.
Oh, absolutely.
And he would have been talking. He would have been talking.
All the things that he didn't like about what was going on in the war. And I mean, these were some really big things that he was going to tell.
And one of those things might have been how he was starved of gasoline when he was about to make a major offensive breakthrough that would have saved thousands of American lives.
Absolutely. Patton was poised. He had chased the Germans out of France, and they were in disarray. And the Germans will tell you this. They were at a point where if he'd have been allowed to go on, he would have won the war in 1944 in the fall. But they held him, and they stole they took his gas away from him so they wouldn't. These were Dwight Eisenhower wanted Montgomery to go to Berlin in another way, which failed. The bridge too far. They stopped him from going on, and as a consequence, the Germans were able to regroup and fight us in the Battle of the Bulge, and we lost more men in the Battle of the Bulge than we did in D-Day.
Yeah, and Patton, if he had been allowed the gas to do it, he could have prevented all of that from happening. And he had a lot to say about when he got his gas starved. And he was independently wealthy. He didn't need the military pension. He was about to thumb his nose at all of his handlers of the last couple of years and tell everything. I think that is a key part to understanding the plot to assassinate Patton, because even if they hadn't assassinated him, oddly enough, high command would have been doing a little jig the day that Patton was killed in a car accident. It makes it all very suspicious. Target Patton is the name of the book. Robert Wilcox returns with your questions and comments. Dean Koontz on tomorrow night. I'm hosting Coast to Coast, and Dean Koontz joins us again on Coast to Coast AM tomorrow. Into this last hour, your chance to ask questions and to comment on the assassination of George S. Patton. Robert Wilcox next on Coast to Coast AM with Ian Punnett. So I tell you what, I just, for whatever reason, my mouse on my computer is not working very well. So I'm going to do this, but I kind of have to do it very slowly. So bear with me as I click through these calls. We'll start with Douglas on the wild card line in San Francisco on Coast to Coast AM for Robert Wilcox. And if I click that just right, Douglas, are you there?
Yes, you did it just right, Mr. Punnett, as always.
Well, not always, but thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, and thanks so much for being there with us, and thank you so much for blessing us with your presence, Mr. Wilcox.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, Mr. Wilcox, I would really love your opinion and your perspective on what I feel obligated to emphasize in terms of what I always perceived as one of General Patton's motivations for trying to take down the Soviets regime. Patton was always a commander to leave no man behind, which motivated his assault on Castle Metz to rescue his son-in-law, something which Ike used to leverage against him as a kind of embarrassment. And one of the major factors in Patton's desire always seemed to me to be to rescue the thousands and thousands of American POWs who were in Soviet captivity, which I'm sure you, as a historian, are well aware of. I mean,
it's in the book, Douglas. In fact, you bring up two things. The Castle Metz thing was kind of a disaster, though, and wasn't just used as leverage against him. It really wasn't very well executed, right, Robert? I mean,
it was kind of the thing that was a problem and a mistake by him, I think, but it was used against him, and I think rightfully so. He even admitted he shouldn't have done something like that.
His heart was in the right place. I mean, he had the right intention.
Yeah.
But this idea about the tens of thousands, as Douglas brings them up, and thank you, Douglas, the tens of thousands of Americans that may have been held by the Soviet Union, how many people are we talking about? And you write about in the book, Patton was aware of it, that were doomed to the Gulag.
Scandalous. There were, the numbers I'm not quite sure of, but 2,000, I could say, 3,000, something like that, of Americans who just at the end of the war were caught behind Russian lines, and they were just taken to the gulags. And the government, the FDR government, because they were protecting the Soviets, would not make an issue out of it. And those men died, and or they're still living today, 95 years old. I doubt that.
But very likely they're dead, and they would have died, sadly, probably just in the brutality of the Gulag.
Exactly.
So enslaved labor, and this is a whole nother show. I mean, how many Americans did our government resign to that fate, saying, look, they were servicemen, they were soldiers, this is part of the risk of war, but instead of bringing them back, said it's better to have a good relationship with the Soviets and lose these men than to bring these men back and risk our relationship with the Soviets.
And Douglas was absolutely right, the caller just now, that it infuriated Patton. He couldn't believe this was happening, and that was one of the secrets he was going to tell.
Yep. West of the Rockies, David is in California on Coast to Coast AM. David?
Good morning, Ian, and good morning, Mr. Wilcox. I've got a little story which I told your screener. My father, who's now been passed on several years, was a World War II vet, and he told me the strange story that he met Patton's driver and had said the driver told him that Patton was not killed in the accident. He had been assassinated. And he told me that. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm here.
Okay, I wasn't sure I did either. And I thought, that's a weird story. My dad saying a guy said Patton had been assassinated, not killed in this accident. So that's kind of weird. And then I heard your show about 11:45 and I go, damn, it's true.
Right. Do we know who the guy was? I mean, because was it the driver that was driving the car that Patton was in when he was hit? Was it that driver?
My father said the driver of Patton's vehicle told him that Patton had been assassinated. The vehicle didn't kill him.
Well,
that's bizarre.
That would be Woodring, but I've never heard that he said that. However, his family told me, his sons told me, that, you see, Woodring was 19 years old when that happened, and whenever he'd go public, he would say the company line. It was an accident. But privately to his family, he had real misgivings about it. It's very strange to me that you would have heard that from him, but it could have happened. Yeah.
Yeah, over a beer, the kind of thing of
sure.
One guy says to another, and I don't know. I think that's interesting. Woodring, was his nickname?
That's right. Yeah, Horace Woody Woodring.
Oh, I would definitely go with Woody if I were Horace.
Yeah, I think he did.
you go Woody if your name's Horace. Mike is in Arizona on Coast to Coast AM. Mike?
Hi, I was wondering if you ever got the Patton G.I. Joe, and that comes with the dog. I was just going to ask you if the dog was the hunting dog that you're referring to in the police car, and was the thing with getting Patton.
What happened?
Hello?
Mike? I don't know. He's gone.
Yeah, I didn't know what that was anyway.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So he was saying that and thank you, Mike. I don't know what happened. The dog in the G.I. Joe Patton set. I wonder if that's the same dog that he was with the day he was killed. I'm intrigued by that thought.
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Patton had that famous little bulldog Willie, who was really a coward, and Willie would not go. You know, Patton used to say, "Come on, Willie, you know, come out of the closet, out of there. You're afraid of your own shadow." No, the hunting dogs that they were with would have been bird dogs, and they would have been a much different. They were not that dog. And if he's talking about a little toy, I would imagine that they would have put Willie with him because he loved Willie. Willie was his dog.
Buddy. Oh, that's so funny. Harry in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on Coast to Coast AM for Robert Wilcox, author of Target Patton. Harry?
Yes, Mr. Wilcox, normally I'm a very skeptical person, but I can't find any flaws in the case that you're presenting. It is very true that Patton was a renegade, and he had an obsession to invade the Soviet Union. And but also the United States also wanted to invade Russia, but the only difference was that Truman didn't think it was feasible. We have to remember that at the end of World War II, the Soviets were at their military peak.
You think so? Robert, would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't agree that they were at their peak, nor that we wanted to go fight them. In both cases, as far as them being at the peak, Patton used to say, he said, "I've seen them. They live off the land. Their trucks are really just ox carts. He said it would take me about 6 weeks, and they would have no more supplies. And an army cannot fight without supplies." To him, it would have been duck soup, really, and that's the way it was. The Russians did not have any kind of army like we did. All they had were men, and they certainly did well with the men, and that's how they won the war. But it took them years to really build up their army again after that war.
And I'm afraid I cut off Harry like I did with the last caller. So Harry, go ahead. Yes. Something's wrong with my mouse here. So Go ahead. You had more you wanted to add on to that?
Yes, please. First of all, military production was at its height in the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Now, are you familiar with General Wilhelm Guderian?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
The mastermind of the Blitzkrieg?
Yes.
Did you know that he was brought to Washington in 1948 to consult with the chiefs of staff on the invasion of the Soviet Union?
In 48?
In 1948, during the Berlin airlift, when the tensions were at their height.
Mm-hmm.
And
I didn't know that, but that's
how do you know that, Harry? Just out of curiosity.
It's a long story. I know it personally. And Heinz Guderian was asked about the prospects of invading the Soviet Union, and he told the chiefs of staff to count him out. He said the territory was too vast, the Russian army was too good, and the Russian winter was formidable.
Right. Oh, well, if anybody would want to say that, of course, it would be a Nazi who would probably not want to have to go down that road twice, you know. But Harry, I appreciate that, but let's go back to that other thought. It wasn't so much that Patton was interested in taking over Russia, not like what Hitler was talking about. He just wanted to push them out of the Eastern Bloc nations.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's a little different. Pushing them back into Russia is different than, say, trying to really trying to take over all of Russia.
I agree with that.
Okay.
48 was also 3 years later. At the end of the war, I just don't see the Russians being a
formidable force.
A formidable force that would have beaten us. They were a force, no question about it, and they were. They did have a war machine, but it was nothing like ours, and we could have beaten them.
Mike is on the first-time caller line in L.A. on Coast to Coast AM for Robert Wilcox. Mike?
Yeah, Mr. Wilcox, I was wondering if you're aware of this movie made in the 80s called Brass Target, with John Cassavetes and George Kennedy and Max Potato.
He references it many times in the book. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that that was from the novel by Frederick Nolan called The Algonquin Project, and that plays heavily in my book because at one point I had to find out whether Bazada had actually read the novel and had picked up stuff from it to to regurgitate and make and say that he had done this, because the novel and the movie have certain things in it that Bazada talks about. Well, in the book in Target Patton, you will read that Bazada's story comes first. So he did not pick it up from that movie, but that's one of the reasons why I dealt with that movie. Yes,
and you say Bazada because it was published in those John Birch Society kind of tabloid papers in the late 70s.
Well, not only that, but earlier than that, 10 years before that, he had told a very fine journalist in Washington, and he had also told 2 Jedburghs that I know of. They didn't believe him. They sort of said, well, okay, we know Douglas. He always talks that way. But the journalist did believe him, and it was her who later on was at that dinner that I talked about that asked the question. That was 10 years later. He had told her, I'm going to tell you something that I know that Patton was murdered and that, I was the one asked to do it. I didn't do it. He told her that 10 years before she was in that situation later.
Right. That's the interesting part about this is that here's this guy, Douglas Bazada, who is the guy who says, I did it, I didn't do it, I did it, I didn't do it. But for him, I did it and didn't do it was merely, I did it in that I arranged the truck accident. I didn't do it in that he wasn't the one to deliver the final poison or the injection or whatever it is that killed Patton in the hospital.
Exactly.
That's the part where, and he sort of takes some solace in the fact that, yeah, he may have set up the stage, he may have set the table for the people to do it, but he didn't do that part. And then at other times, he feels totally responsible for what happened to Patton because he knows if he hadn't done his job so well, the other people wouldn't have had the opportunity.
Yes.
I actually went looking for artwork by Douglas Bazada.
Did you?
Yeah, I was just curious because he, as he goes on to have this cover in Europe after the war of being a painter and a wine connoisseur, et cetera, I thought, well, maybe some of his works are still out there, and I haven't been able to find any.
You haven't been able to find any?
No, have you? Have you seen any?
Yeah, he showed me several of them. They were modern art type things, which are not really the type that I like. He did several paintings about crabs, which are modern art, and one of which was the sort of the highlight of the show that Grace Kelly gave in Monaco for him. And I have a picture in the book of him with Grace, and they're looking at that, and he's, explaining to her about it. No, I haven't found any, no.
I was just curious what they're trading for.
I don't know. This would be interesting.
What does a Bazada go for? A guy who claims that he killed Patton, does his artwork go up in value afterward?
Something else he did was he says that he could paint things like other artists and make fakes. And in the book, he did sell one for $20,000 to one of these war profiteers and did it, laughingly because they took the money and the co-op, this group that he ran, used it. So
Ray is on the wild card line in Toledo, Ohio, for our friend Robert Wilcox on Coast to Coast AM. Ray?
Yes. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Yes. My question is this. I've been trying to follow you intensely as you went over your book in the summary. How far did this plot go up the ladder? Was it hatched from the White House?
Good question.
Eisenhower knew about
Great
it?
question. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can't tell you that. All I can tell you is that Donovan, the head of the OSS, which became the CIA, told Bazada to do this. Where does Donovan get his orders? We don't know. But Donovan reported to FDR. He reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marshall, and some others.
Okay. You still there? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Mickey is in Tucson, Arizona on Coast to Coast AM. Did I lose him? Did I do something?
Oh, no, sir. I'm here.
Oh, no. Mickey's there, but I may have lost the guest. And you know what? I'm going to ask Jason. Somehow this mouse is just totally malfunctioning on this end. If you could ask Gina to go ahead and get Robert back, with my apologies. And Jason, I'm going to ask you to run the phones from this point forward, if you would. That's the second time I've cut him off, and I'm sorry about that. I think we're getting Robert back right now. But, Mickey, what was your question?
My question was about the medical records. A couple years back, I was reading up on this, and I read somewhere that all the medical records for General Patton are missing. And I was just going to see if Mr. Wilcox, if he knows anything about that. Great topic, great show.
Well, I appreciate that, Mickey, and I will tell you, just as having been a reader, go ahead, you got him there. Jason, you got Mickey there. That I can just tell you as a reader of the book, yes, these records are missing all over the life of Patton, and that oddly enough, there doesn't even seem to be an explanation for why the records are missing. Now they have a lot of the medical records. I mean, they know like where his, they know which vertebra was broken, and they can reconstruct, and Robert does in the book. He reconstructs the way that the surgeons were treating the broken neck, but it was, that there were most of the records concerning the investigation are gone, and that was really more the key part. Robert's back.
Yes, I'm back here.
I'm sorry about that. I did that. I told at the beginning of the hour, I warned everybody I had a mad mouse, and I could see that it wasn't operating correctly, and it had a mind of its own. So let me flesh that out a little bit more. What of the medical records are still with us for what happens after the crash of Patton, and what is missing?
We have a lot of the medical records. That's the most that I have, and it gives a clear picture of what happens to him. Except that some of them are you can't read them. They're so badly copied and so on.
That's what it is. Yeah, they're just very faint. Let's go to David in Atlanta on Coast to Coast AM for Robert Wilcox, and I'm not touching the phones. So, Jason, it's got to be you. David in Atlanta on the wild card line on Coast to Coast. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, hey, Ian, a fascinating show. You do come up with some fascinating subjects.
This was all me. Let me tell you, I'm going to add to that. When this book came in, they put this on like a personal courier to get this to me, right? Because I know this is exactly my kind of book. David, do you have time to get your question in before the bottom of the hour and the answer afterward?
Isn't it far-fetched that they would think that this man could shoot Patton, could get close enough to the car to shoot Patton with this bolt from an air gun, with General Gay sitting right beside him, and General Gay not being an eyewitness. Of course, the driver was also a witness, but I believe you said he was complicit.
Good question. All right, well, then let's hang on for that answer, David, and thank you. We'll get Robert Wilcox coming up. How did they think they were going to be able to get away with that? And what was the precedent for getting away with that, too? Might be another way of looking at that next. The book is Target Patton, The Plot to Assassinate General George S. Patton. The book tomorrow night is Your Heart Belongs to Me, and I'll be on with Dean Koontz. Always a pleasure to have him back, and whenever Dean comes on, especially around the holidays, we'll spend some time talking about the mystery of dogs, too. Tomorrow night on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. The story of George S. Patton. The plot to assassinate General Patton. Target Patton is the name of the book. Robert Wilcox. We'll take your questions and comments, and we'll answer that last question first on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Heading into our last half hour, Robert Wilcox. So you heard the question there at the bottom of the hour. You want to pick that up?
Yeah. Well, you got to remember, these guys, an assassin like this is what they do. They are really well honed at how to do this kind of thing. At the moment of impact, there's terrible confusion in everyone's mind. And in fact, when this happened, General Gay was on the left side. He's looking out the left side. He's not looking at Patton. Patton is on the right side. There's a space between them for, a couple people, actually. And Patton is looking out the right side. The driver is looking forward. Nobody ever saw what happened to Patton. At the moment of impact, says Bezada, he shoots. This is fast. It's just as fast as if it was a cartridge, but it's got a bolt. And that bolt comes out of there, and he's got this terrible smash in the face. And
enough impact, theoretically, to break a man's neck.
Easily. I checked that out. That's easily, it could happen there. So suddenly, in this moment of confusion, there's the impact. And suddenly, when Gay turns to look towards Patton, Patton is already on top of him. So it's all happened in an instant. And read Target Patton. You will see it's very plausible.
Right. I think, but it's a fair question.
Oh, fair question. Absolutely.
How did they think they would be able to get away with this? Part of it is because they already had these types of accidents had been staged, and these kind of assassinations have been sort of successfully pulled off for years.
And these guys are surgeons. I mean, they know how to do this. Whereas if you were asked to do it, you'd be all thumbs. They know
no, not me. No, I've got your book. Now I know how. So they hire me. I pull out your book. Now if I were hired to do that, it would look suspiciously like what you write about in the book. I'm afraid. But all right, let's go ahead and get who we start with next. Let's go to Tom in Boston, east of the Rockies on Coast to Coast AM for Robert Wilcox. Tom.
Good evening, gentlemen.
And you.
Back in around 96, 97, I belonged to this club. It's called the AHEPA, and I'm of Greek descent. And I had just finished reading Carlo D'Este's book, Genius of War. And in there they talked about a sergeant that was called in after Patton had passed away. And there's a gentleman up there by the name of Paul. I won't give him his last name, although he's no longer with us. He was an undertaker. And he says, that was me. I was the only mortician in Germany. He said they called me over there, and I went over there. And I guess you pointed out in your book, he was kept downstairs, or in one of the other books, in the basement. And he actually had a lock of his hair. He actually cut a lock of his hair and kept it. And I asked Paul, I said, Paul, I want to ask you a question. I mean, you've been taking care of bodies for the last 30 years. When they wrapped him up to ship him back to the States, could that have constricted his breathing and maybe to cause a blood clot or pneumonia or whatever? And, of course, he looked off, and he, for about a minute, which seemed like an hour, he said, yeah, that could have caused it. It could have. Of course, we don't know.
Right.
In other words, whatever we're talking about tonight, he had no knowledge of that at all. All right. But he told me that story, and he named each and every one of the doctors that were there. And if you check the records out, you're going to find it was Paul. I can give you his last name if you'd like it.
Who was the undertaker for the army?
He was the only mortician there in Germany at that time at the end of the war.
Tom, I appreciate that. Robert Wilcox, where are you with that?
Well, I don't know how that relates to him dying because he's already dead. So that if they wrap him in something after he's dead, why he's already dead. There was no autopsy. I know that, and he was not shipped home. By the way, he was taken to a field where other Americans had died and buried there. So I'm just not clear on what that was.
All right, Target Patton. It was a conspiracy to kill General George S. Patton, and William is in Wisconsin on Coast to Coast AM. William?
Good show, as always. I have a question of your guest.
Yes.
Are you aware, sir, that Churchill was a supporter of Patton? Churchill wanted the British, along with some American troops, to invade Russia from Greece northward, while Patton was to invade through Poland and the Baltic countries, along with the Finns, who were the greatest fighters in winter wars, as you know, and who had lost thousands of troops fighting the Russians into Russia. And why the Finns? Because the Finns had sister tribes, Finno-Ugrics, tons of them in Russia, ready to revolt. They were fed up with their control of them by the Zionists and the Slavs, who were very cruel to them and who to this day still are. Are you aware that Churchill was a great supporter of Patton?
Well, let me say this.
Thank you, William.
Churchill might have been, but you know there are indications that it's possible that the British somehow were involved in this as well. I know Montgomery didn't like Patton, and there was some tension between there. As far as Churchill goes, I don't know yes or no about that.
They would seem to be birds of a feather in one case, Churchill and Patton.
I would imagine so. I would think so, too.
And whether he made some sort of offhand comment about how it could have been done. But you don't have there were no plans that were drawn up that you're aware of where they would have gone into Russia through Greece.
No, I don't know that, although that may have been talked about at some point, yeah.
All right, first-time caller line, Don is in Albany, New York for Robert Wilcox, Target Patton. Don?
Hello. I'd like to know if General Eisenhower was aware of the plot, and also why didn't they just remove or reassign General Patton?
Yeah, well, it's a fair question. They did, actually, but go ahead, Robert.
They did reassign him, but the question about Eisenhower is an interesting one, because if there was anyone who had reason to get rid of Patton, it would be Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a great diplomat, but a terrible tactician. And a lot of men died because of what Eisenhower, how he conducted the war and by holding Patton back. We already talked about how the Battle of the Bulge came simply because they'd held Patton back, and we almost got kicked out of Europe because of that. If it wasn't for Patton to go up there and rescue those guys, why the Germans may have kicked us out of Europe. And there were similarly other areas earlier, the Falaise Gap. In the beginning of his march across France, Patton could have killed so many more Germans if he'd have been allowed to close what is called the Falaise Gap. But Montgomery was supposed to do that, and Patton Eisenhower would not let Patton close that gap. And the same Germans that got out of there came back and hit us at the Bulge. So I'm not saying that Dwight Eisenhower did this. I'm just saying that there are a lot of suspects, and you'd have to look at every one of them.
You know, I think we have time to save a minute or two at the end for a quick parallel on the assassination attempt on John Wayne, just to give an idea of in fact, how freely people thought about assassinating folks, and especially the Soviets, who were really good at this one way or another. Jim is in Burbank on Coast to Coast AM. Jim?
Hi, good evening.
Hi, you're talking to Robert Wilcox.
Yes, sir. Mr. Wilcox, I did meet and become friends with the interpreter for Patton. I wasn't sure if you came across his name during your research.
No, this would be what, the Russian interpreter?
No, French. Ex-French journalist.
Oh, French
Jean-Claude.
journalist. Okay. You know, Patton spoke French very well.
Isn't that odd that he would have? This guy was on his staff. He had this guy had a life that could write 5 books. He was a well-known French journalist that was sent to Vietnam, captured by the Viet Cong, forced to write down their manifesto. He could care less, actually. He said, they wanted me to write it down, I wrote it down, and sent it back to his news company, and they published it. The Vietnamese released him. He went home, they fired him.
Yeah, but he says he was Patton's interpreter.
At one point in his life, he told me how France was back in the day. The Germans so crisp and so sharp. He said the Frenchman with a bottle of wine in his back pocket and dirty uniform and 4 o'clock shadow. He said for any of the French to think that they could defeat those finely tuned machine-like troops, he said it was crazy.
Right. Well, thank you, Jim. Interesting. And I think there was an aspect of Patton that was pretty cool. He, for all of his coarseness, he was very well educated. He was one smart guy.
Very.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk, and then we'll hang on. We'll get to John in Iowa coming up here in just a second. But let's take a minute to talk about the assassination attempt on John Wayne, or at least the plot to assassinate John Wayne. Talk about that.
Well, this brings up Stalin, and we haven't talked about Steven Skubik, who is the other part of the book that. Very important part. This was a CIC agent who was working with the Russians after the war and who discovered the plot against Patton. He was told about it by some very high-level Ukrainians who were infiltrated into the NKVD. Stalin.
Well, you have to explain what these things are. Right? That's the secret police for the Russians.
That's right.
And the CIC was
the counterintelligence corps. And what they did was they were to find out about plots that were going on. His real job was to find Nazi plots. But as it turned out, what his sources were telling him, high-level sources, were that Stalin had ordered the death of Patton. And, you know, Bazada is there that day on that accident with what appears to be a Russian. So that we haven't talked about that, but a Russian is involved. In any case, Stalin, you know, was a mass murderer. He would sit at his desk in Moscow, and like doing a crossword, he would be checking off names of people who would be murdered. Well, he ordered the murder of John Wayne. This is after the war, and 2 guys actually came here. This is all in a book about John Wayne. 2 guys came here to Hollywood and tried to do it, and John Wayne found out about it, and he and one of his tough screenwriters actually caught the 2 guys. The FBI were with them, but they posed as FBI members, and they took them out to Malibu out here and did a sort of a fake Russian roulette. And the 2 assassins were so scared they actually defected because they couldn't go home because they'd blown their assignment. But that actually occurred, and so Stalin, the idea that he would order to kill Patton is very plausible. If he'd try to have John Wayne murdered, I think Patton would have been the more fruitful one.
And it's so interesting that he targeted John Wayne. And targeted John Wayne, why?
Because John Wayne was a real anti-communist and who really took up the cudgel here in the early days of anti-communism here in the 50s and so on. And he had been apparently one of Stalin's agents was a film producer. And he had come from Russia. He was over here being wined and dined. And when he went back to Russia, he said, John Wayne is your worst enemy in America. And that really made Stalin. Stalin was just a dictator. He just, he'd kill anybody who he didn't like.
John is in Iowa on Coast to Coast AM. John?
How you guys doing?
Good. You're talking to Robert Wilcox. Go ahead.
How you doing, Mr. Wilcox? I just wondered, and I've heard stories like this before. You write a book like this, and it's long after the fact. But even with that, how does something like this, hit the presses and not garner the sort of attention from the media, and then also the suspicion of the American people against their
Well, you get the attention of the media. I'm the media. We're all the media.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the mass media. I mean.
I know. I'm just kidding you, John. I'm just kidding you.
Well, it's a good question, and I have, I've been on many shows about this. The New York Times hasn't yet written a story about it, but the book only came out 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And this is a really big story. Now, it does have ramifications that I think the media, which is predominantly liberal and would be predominantly might, if they really read the book, they might begin to get a little leery about it because it doesn't look good for FDR and his administration. But I think it will get that kind of a play eventually because it's a historical. This is all true, and what this is a real mystery. But it's the first time that anyone has ever brought all this to light. It's always been downplayed, I think, because it was well planned, it was well covered up, and historians always followed the company line. And now this has been blown apart here, and it's going to get more play. Believe me.
I believe you. When's it going to be a feature on the History Channel?
Well, whenever they call me, I'll send them to my agent.
They haven't yet. It surprised me. This is
up.
I
don't know that they know about it yet. I mean, the book was just published December 1st.
I know, and you're on this.
You're the first guy who's really taking it coast to coast, and I thank you for it. And you are the media, and people are learning about it.
And I couldn't get this book on fast enough.
Well, because it's a great story, and
it's a very interesting story, and well researched too. And in the end, I have to be totally candid with you, and I think you'll agree with me. I mean, you have everything there. I mean, there's so many interesting loose ends. But, it does lack the smoking gun, or should I say the smoking bolt. I mean, and you can't help that. I mean, it's history, and it's all and so, like, you can't get access to these records. You can't find some of these other things. So you have to deal with a certain amount of what's behind the curtain that you can't see.
Absolutely. And this is a great, true mystery. But there's enough there that I could go before a grand jury, and I know I'd get an indictment. Would I get a conviction? I don't know. We don't even know who it is that convict right now.
Exactly.
And
it'd be a RICO thing. You'd have to do RICO. You'd have to get everybody involved in it.
Well, Ian, the point of all this is to get somebody who's bigger and stronger than me, that is a government investigation of this, because now the lid has been pried open and we've seen all the worms. We've got to get deeper than that and find out what really happened, because George Patton was our greatest fighting general. He was a great American, and he deserves better than to have this bottled up.
Don is in Dallas on Coast to Coast AM. Don?
Yeah. Hey, can you hear me okay?
We sure can. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll agree. Patton is probably one of the greatest generals ever. I think he's great. However, to say things like if we had just let him cut loose, he would have ended the war sooner, I disagree. They cut his fuel supply off when he was advancing because he got ahead of the Supply Corps' ability to resupply him with food, fuel, munitions.
That's not true.
And he was exposed.
Go ahead. Well, let Don give him a chance to respond. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, that's not true. He had hundreds of thousands of gallons, but it wasn't enough to supply all his tanks, and then they took that stock from him. It was there to be put into his tanks. They took it from him. He didn't get ahead. And the final thing I'll say is ask the Germans if he could not have ended the war earlier. They have testified this. That's a matter of record. They were in disarray when he was poised to go into Germany in late 1944, in September, I believe it was. They knew that they'll tell you, we would have lost the war within a month. But when they stopped him by taking away his gas, he hadn't outrun his gas. That was part of the plan, was to stop the gas.
Time out. Well, thank you so much, Robert Wilcox. Enjoyed it. Look forward to it. Look forward to seeing where this book goes from here.
Thanks a lot, Ian.
And we'll be reading about it, and I'm sure we'll get you back on sometime. Have a happy holiday. What a great gift for somebody for Christmas. Target Patton, the plot to assassinate General George S. Patton. Deus te amat. Oh, and I'll see you on tomorrow night, though, right? Yeah, we're going to do Dean Koontz tomorrow night, and I do too.